The feudal world of Chogoris spun through the void at the galaxy's edge, its windswept steppes and towering mountain ranges harboring a civilization that had remained largely unchanged for millennia. Here, beneath alien constellations, nomadic tribes pursued their ancient ways of life, following the seasonal migrations of their herds across vast grasslands that stretched beyond the horizon. The planet's harsh beauty was matched only by the fierce independence of its people, who valued speed, cunning, and personal honor above all else. It was into this world that one of the Emperor's lost sons arrived, cast across the galaxy by the machinations of chaos during the scattering of the Primarchs from their gestation chambers on Terra. The infant who would become known as Jaghatai Khan crashed into the Altak Mountains in a pod of unknown origin, his arrival witnessed only by the howling winds and the scattered wildlife of the high peaks. The child's superhuman constitution allowed him to survive the brutal cold and thin air that would have killed any normal human infant within minutes. Khan, chieftain of the Taliskar tribe, discovered the child during a hunting expedition in the treacherous mountain passes. The grizzled tribal leader had been tracking a wounded snow leopard when he heard what he initially mistook for the cry of some unknown predator echoing from a rocky outcropping. Following the sound, he found the infant lying naked among the twisted wreckage of his pod, seemingly unharmed despite the obvious violence of his landing. The child's unusual features, his pale skin and dark hair contrasting sharply with the typical appearance of the Chogorian peoples, marked him immediately as an outsider, yet something in his fierce gaze spoke to the old chieftain's warrior instincts. Khan took the foundling back to his tribe, naming him Jaghatai after a legendary hero from Chogorian folklore. The boy's rapid development soon became apparent to all who observed him. While other children his age struggled to walk, Jaghatai was already demonstrating reflexes and coordination that defied explanation. By his third year, he could ride the small steppe ponies with the skill of a seasoned horseman, and his ability to learn the complex oral traditions of the Taliskar seemed almost supernatural in its speed and accuracy. The nomadic lifestyle of the Altak mountain tribes provided the perfect environment for the young Primarch's development. The Taliskar followed ancient migration routes through high mountain passes and hidden valleys, their movements dictated by the seasons and the availability of grazing for their herds. This constant motion, combined with the ever-present threat of raids from rival tribes, created a culture where adaptability and martial skill were essential for survival. Jaghatai absorbed these lessons with an intensity that both impressed and occasionally unsettled his adoptive family. As he entered adolescence, Jaghatai's physical capabilities became impossible to ignore. He could outrun the swiftest horses across short distances, and his strength allowed him to draw composite bows that veteran warriors found difficult to string. More importantly, his tactical mind began to manifest in the small-scale conflicts that were a constant feature of tribal life. When rival clans attempted to steal Taliskar livestock or encroach upon their traditional grazing grounds, it was often Jaghatai's strategies that turned potential defeats into decisive victories. The young Primarch's first major military success came during his 16th year, when a confederation of 3 hostile tribes launched a coordinated attack on the Taliskar during the vulnerable period of spring migration. The enemy had chosen their moment well, striking when the tribe's herds were spread across several valleys, and their warriors were divided into small protective groups. Traditional Chogorian tactics would have called for a defensive stance, gathering the scattered forces before attempting any counterattack. Jaghatai proposed a radically different approach. Rather than consolidating their position, he advocated for a series of lightning strikes against each enemy tribe in turn, using their superior knowledge of the local terrain to achieve tactical surprise. His plan required precise timing and absolute commitment from every warrior involved, as failure would leave the Taliskar completely exposed to retaliation. Khan, recognizing the genius in his adopted son's strategy despite its apparent recklessness, gave his consent to the audacious plan. The campaign that followed became legendary among the mountain tribes. Jaghatai led a force of fewer than 200 warriors in a series of dawn raids that systematically dismantled the enemy confederation. Each attack struck at the moment when the targeted tribe was least prepared, exploiting gaps in their defenses that Jaghatai had identified through careful reconnaissance. The speed of movement between targets prevented any coordinated response, and within 10 days, all three hostile tribes had been scattered or forced to sue for peace. This victory established Jaghatai's reputation as a military prodigy, but it also revealed something deeper about his character. Unlike many successful young warriors, he showed no interest in personal glory or the accumulation of trophies from defeated enemies. Instead, he focused on the strategic implications of each victory and the lessons that could be learned from every engagement. His approach to warfare combined the traditional Chogorian emphasis on mobility and surprise with an analytical mindset that seemed to anticipate his enemies' moves several steps in advance. The political landscape of Chogoris during this period was characterized by endless cycles of alliance and betrayal among hundreds of competing tribes. The planet's harsh environment and limited resources ensured that conflict was a constant reality, with successful tribes expanding their territory at the expense of weaker neighbors. This system had persisted for thousands of years, creating a warrior culture that valued individual prowess and tribal loyalty above all other considerations. Jaghatai's rise to prominence within the Taliskar coincided with a period of increasing instability across the steppes. Climate changes had disrupted traditional migration patterns, forcing tribes into closer contact and intensifying competition for scarce resources. Several powerful chieftains had begun attempting to forge larger confederations, seeking to dominate their neighbors through superior numbers rather than the traditional emphasis on mobility and skill. Recognizing that these changes threatened the survival of smaller tribes like the Taliskar, Jaghatai began to advocate for a new approach to intertribal politics. His vision went beyond the simple defensive alliances that had occasionally formed in the past, instead proposing a systematic unification of the mountain tribes under a single leadership structure that would preserve their cultural identity while providing the strength necessary to resist external threats. The implementation of this vision required years of careful diplomacy combined with decisive military action. Jaghatai's reputation as a warrior allowed him to speak as an equal with established chieftains, while his strategic insights provided practical solutions to the problems facing their peoples. He demonstrated a remarkable ability to identify the core interests that different tribes shared, building coalitions based on mutual benefit rather than simple domination. The process of unification was neither swift nor bloodless. Many tribal leaders viewed Jaghatai's proposals as threats to their traditional authority, and some chose to resist through force of arms. These conflicts tested the young Primarch's military capabilities on an increasingly large scale, as he found himself commanding forces numbering in the thousands rather than the small raiding parties of his earlier campaigns. The tactics that emerged from these larger engagements would eventually become the foundation of the White Scars Legion's approach to warfare. Jaghatai refined the traditional Chogorian emphasis on mounted warfare, developing new formations and techniques that maximized the shock value of cavalry charges while maintaining the flexibility to adapt to changing battlefield conditions. His forces became known for their ability to appear without warning, strike with devastating effect, and vanish before enemy reinforcements could respond. Central to Jaghatai's military philosophy was the concept of the decisive moment, the critical point in any engagement where swift action could determine the outcome regardless of numerical disadvantage. He trained his followers to recognize these moments and to commit themselves completely when they arose, understanding that hesitation or half measures would inevitably lead to defeat. This approach required not only exceptional skill and courage from individual warriors, but also an unprecedented level of coordination and trust throughout the entire force. The spiritual dimensions of Chogorian culture played an equally important role in Jaghatai's rise to power. The nomadic tribes maintained ancient shamanic traditions that emphasized harmony with the natural world and respect for the spirits of the steppes. These beliefs provided a unifying framework that transcended tribal boundaries, offering a basis for cooperation that went beyond mere political convenience. Jaghatai's integration of these spiritual traditions into his political and military activities demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of Chogorian psychology. Rather than attempting to impose new beliefs or practices, he positioned himself as a guardian and interpreter of ancient wisdom, claiming that the spirits themselves had revealed the necessity of tribal unification. This approach allowed him to present radical changes as returns to forgotten truths, making them more acceptable to conservative tribal elders. The Path of Heaven, as Jagatai's philosophical system came to be known, represented a synthesis of traditional Chogorian values with new strategic realities. It emphasized the importance of movement and adaptation, teaching that strength came not from rigid adherence to fixed positions, but from the ability to respond fluidly to changing circumstances. This philosophy applied equally to warfare, politics, and personal conduct, providing a comprehensive worldview that could guide decision-making in any situation. The practical application of these principles required extensive changes to traditional tribal structures and practices. Jaghatai established new systems of communication that allowed widely separated groups to coordinate their activities, developed standardized training methods that ensured consistent tactical capabilities across different tribes, and created mechanisms for sharing resources and information that had previously been closely guarded tribal secrets. By his 25th year, Jaghatai had succeeded in unifying most of the mountain tribes under his leadership, earning the title of Khan, a position that combined military command, political authority, and spiritual guidance. His domain stretched across thousands of square kilometers of some of the most challenging terrain on Chogoris, encompassing dozens of formerly independent tribes that now acknowledged his supremacy while maintaining their distinct cultural identities. The establishment of the Kagan's dominion marked a fundamental transformation in Chogorian society. For the first time in recorded history, large portions of the planet were united under a single leadership structure that respected local traditions while providing the coordination necessary for large-scale military and economic activities. This achievement demonstrated not only Jaghatai's exceptional capabilities as a leader, but also his deep understanding of the cultural forces that shaped his adopted world. The integration of shamanic traditions into the new political order proved particularly significant for the future development of Chogorian society. Rather than viewing these ancient practices as obstacles to progress, Jaghatai recognized their value as sources of wisdom and social cohesion. He established formal roles for tribal shamans within his administration, ensuring that traditional knowledge would be preserved and transmitted even as political structures evolved. This approach created a unique synthesis between spiritual and temporal authority that would later influence the White Scars Legion's relationship with imperial doctrine. The shamanic emphasis on harmony with natural forces complemented Jaghatai's tactical philosophy, while the traditional respect for ancestral wisdom provided a foundation for maintaining unit cohesion across the vast distances of interstellar warfare. The success of tribal unification also demonstrated the effectiveness of Jaghatai's approach to leadership development. Rather than concentrating all authority in his own person, he systematically identified and trained capable subordinates who could operate independently while maintaining loyalty to the overall strategic vision. This decentralized command structure proved essential for managing the vast territories under his control and would later become a defining characteristic of the White Scars' operational methods. The Emperor's arrival on Chogoris came during the final phase of what Imperial records would later classify as Compliance Action 312 Ultima, though the reality of the situation bore little resemblance to the typical planetary conquests that had characterized the Great Crusade's expansion. The Master of Mankind had tracked the psychic resonance of his lost son across the galaxy's edge, following traces of power that had grown stronger with each passing year, as Jaghatai's influence spread across the steppes. What the Emperor found upon entering the Chogoris system was not a primitive world awaiting enlightenment, but a planet already unified under the rule of one who bore the unmistakable genetic signature of a Primarch. The Imperial fleet that translated into real space above Chogoris consisted of 12 vessels, including the flagship Bucephalus and elements of the First Expeditionary Fleet. Accompanying the Emperor were representatives from several Space Marine legions, Mechanicum Tech adepts, and Imperial Army units prepared for what they had anticipated would be a standard compliance operation. The initial auger sweeps revealed a world with minimal orbital infrastructure and no significant void-based defenses, leading many within the expedition to assume they faced another technologically backward civilization requiring forceful integration into the growing Imperium. The Emperor's psychic senses, however, painted a far different picture. The planet below resonated with familiar patterns of thought and emotion, concentrated most strongly in the mountainous regions where Jaghatai had established his seat of power. The master of mankind recognized immediately that his son had not merely survived his exile, but had thrived, creating something unprecedented in the annals of human civilization. Rather than ordering an immediate planetary assault, the Emperor commanded his fleet to maintain high orbit while he assessed the situation developing below. Jaghatai's response to the arrival of the Imperial fleet demonstrated both his strategic acumen and his deep understanding of his own limitations. The Khan had been aware for several years that Chogoris existed within a larger galactic community, as captured raiders from off-world had spoken of vast stellar empires and technologies beyond anything his people possessed. The sudden appearance of massive warships in orbit above his world could only mean that representatives of this larger civilization had finally taken notice of Chogoris and its unified tribes. The Khan's immediate actions revealed the careful balance he maintained between curiosity and caution. Rather than attempting to hide his forces or prepare for a hopeless defensive campaign, he ordered the lighting of signal fires across the mountain peaks, creating a visible display of organization and control that would be clearly observable from orbit. Simultaneously, he dispatched his fastest riders to gather intelligence from the scattered settlements that maintained primitive communications equipment, seeking any information about the intentions of the mysterious visitors. The Emperor's decision to make planetfall came after 3 days of orbital observation, during which his enhanced senses had confirmed beyond doubt that the psychic signature emanating from the planet's surface belonged to one of his lost sons. The landing site chosen was a broad plateau in the Kumkarta Mountains, approximately 50 kilometers from Jaghatai's primary stronghold. The selection demonstrated the Emperor's understanding of Chogorian customs, as the location was neutral ground that would not be perceived as either threatening or submissive. The initial meeting between father and son took place at dawn on the 4th day following the Imperial fleet's arrival. Jaghatai approached the landing site with a retinue of his most trusted warriors, their horses' hooves creating rhythmic thunder against the rocky ground as they descended from the mountain passes. The Khan himself rode at the column's head, his bearing radiating the confidence of one accustomed to command, while his eyes constantly assessed the strange craft that had descended from the stars. The Emperor awaited his son's arrival, standing alone on the plateau's center, having dismissed his own retinue to positions several hundred meters distant. The master of mankind's appearance had been carefully calculated to avoid overwhelming the Chogorian delegation while still demonstrating his own supernatural nature. He wore relatively simple robes of deep gold, with only the subtle play of psychic energy around his form indicating his true power to those capable of perceiving such things. The moment of recognition between the two proved immediate and profound. Despite having never met, both father and son felt the unmistakable resonance of shared genetic heritage, a connection that transcended mere physical similarity. Jaghatai's senses detected power radiating from the golden figure before him that dwarfed anything he had previously encountered, while the Emperor perceived in his son the successful culmination of genetic engineering combined with the wisdom gained through decades of leadership and conflict. The conversation that followed would later be remembered as one of the most significant diplomatic exchanges in imperial history, though few records of its specific content survived the subsequent millennia. What is known is that the Emperor presented his vision of human unity and the necessity of the Great Crusade, while Jaghatai challenged many of the fundamental assumptions underlying imperial doctrine. The Khan's questions focused particularly on the relationship between individual freedom and collective security, a tension that had shaped his own approach to unifying the Chogorian tribes. Jaghatai's skepticism of the imperial truth manifested most clearly in his examination of its materialist philosophy. The Khan had spent years integrating the shamanic traditions of his adopted people with practical governance, creating systems that acknowledged spiritual dimensions of existence while maintaining rational approaches to problem solving. The emperor's insistence that such beliefs represented primitive superstition conflicted directly with Jaghatai's lived experience of phenomena that defied purely materialist explanation. The emperor argued that unity of purpose and doctrine was essential for humanity's survival in a hostile galaxy, pointing to the constant threats posed by alien civilizations and the chaotic forces that sought to destroy human progress. Jaghatai countered that excessive centralization would inevitably lead to stagnation and tyranny, arguing that diversity of thought and approach was humanity's greatest strength. These discussions revealed the depth of Jaghatai's political philosophy, which had evolved far beyond the simple tribal structures from which it had emerged. The Khan's system of governance balanced central coordination with local autonomy, allowing individual communities to maintain their cultural identities while contributing to larger strategic objectives. This approach had proven successful on Chogoris, but the emperor questioned whether it could function on the galactic scale required by the Great Crusade. The resolution of their philosophical differences came not through victory of one position over another, but through mutual recognition of shared fundamental values. Both father and son prioritized human survival and prosperity above all other considerations, and both understood that achieving these goals required difficult compromises between competing principles. The emperor acknowledged that Jaghatai's approach had achieved remarkable results on Chogoris, while the Khan recognized that the threats facing humanity in the broader galaxy demanded responses beyond the capabilities of any single world. The ceremonial adoption of the Fifth Legion represented a transformation that extended far beyond simple changes in nomenclature and organization. The Terran-born Space Marines who had served as the Legion's core since its founding found themselves inheriting not just a new name and heraldry, but an entirely different approach to warfare and brotherhood. The White Scars, as they now became known, would need to integrate the tactical doctrines developed on Chogoris with the standardized imperial methods that had guided their previous campaigns. The process of transformation began with the arrival of the first Chogorian recruits at the Legion's primary fortress monastery on Terra. These young warriors brought with them not only exceptional skill in mounted combat and reconnaissance, but also cultural traditions that had been refined over millennia of nomadic life. Their integration with existing Legion personnel created immediate challenges, as fundamental differences in worldview and methodology became apparent during training exercises and strategic planning sessions. The Terran veterans of the Fifth Legion had spent decades perfecting techniques of siege warfare and urban combat, specializing in the methodical reduction of fortified positions and the systematic conquest of heavily defended worlds. Their approach to warfare emphasized careful preparation, overwhelming firepower, and the patient accumulation of tactical advantages. These methods had proven highly effective in numerous compliance campaigns, earning the Legion a reputation for reliability and thoroughness among Imperial commanders. The Chogorian warriors, by contrast, had been trained in traditions that prioritized speed, flexibility, and the exploitation of enemy weaknesses through rapid maneuver. Their preferred tactics involved lightning strikes against vulnerable targets, followed by immediate withdrawal before enemy forces could respond effectively. This approach required exceptional individual skill and unit coordination, but offered the potential for achieving decisive results with minimal casualties when properly executed. The integration of these contrasting tactical philosophies created significant tension within the Legion's command structure. Terran officers questioned the reliability of strategies, that seemed to depend heavily on factors beyond direct control, while Chogorian leaders criticized what they viewed as the excessive rigidity of traditional imperial methods. These disagreements extended beyond mere tactical preferences to encompass fundamental questions about the nature of warfare and the responsibilities of military leadership. Jaghatai's approach to resolving these conflicts demonstrated his understanding of both cultural dynamics and military necessity. Rather than imposing either system wholesale, he initiated a comprehensive review of Legion doctrine that examined the effectiveness of different approaches under various operational conditions. This analysis revealed that both Terran and Chogorian methods possessed distinct advantages that could be leveraged in appropriate circumstances. The development of new tactical doctrines required extensive experimentation and training, as Legion personnel worked to master techniques that combined elements from both traditions. The process proved particularly challenging for Space Marines who had spent decades perfecting specific skill sets, as they now needed to develop capabilities in areas that had previously been outside their primary focus. Terran veterans learned mounted combat and rapid reconnaissance techniques, while Chogorian recruits studied siege warfare and heavy weapons employment. The cultural integration proved equally complex, as differences in language, customs, and social organization created barriers to effective communication and cooperation. The Chogorian emphasis on personal honor and tribal loyalty sometimes conflicted with imperial military hierarchy, while Terran adherence to standardized procedures occasionally frustrated warriors accustomed to greater tactical flexibility. These tensions required careful management to prevent them from undermining unit cohesion and operational effectiveness. The transformation of the Legion's organizational structure reflected Jaghatai's understanding that effective integration required more than superficial changes to existing systems. The traditional Imperial Legion structure, with its emphasis on centralized command and standardized unit compositions, needed modification to accommodate the Chogorian preference for autonomous operation and flexible force organization. The resulting hybrid system maintained overall strategic coordination while allowing individual units greater latitude in tactical execution. The adoption of Chogorian cultural elements extended beyond military organization to encompass broader aspects of Legion identity. The White Scars began incorporating traditional ceremonies and rituals into their practices, creating new traditions that honored both their Terran origins and their Chogorian heritage. These cultural adaptations helped forge stronger bonds between personnel from different backgrounds while establishing a distinct identity that set the Legion apart from its peers. The process of creating this new Legion identity required careful balance between innovation and continuity. Jaghatai recognized that excessive change would alienate existing personnel and undermine operational effectiveness, while insufficient adaptation would fail to realize the potential benefits of Chogorian integration. The solution involved gradual implementation of new practices alongside preservation of successful existing methods, allowing the Legion to evolve organically rather than through imposed transformation. The early campaigns conducted by the newly transformed White Scars provided practical testing grounds for their evolving tactical doctrines and organizational structures. These operations revealed both the strengths and limitations of their hybrid approach, leading to further refinements in training methods and operational procedures. The Legion's performance during this period established patterns that would characterize their contributions to the Great Crusade for decades to come. The transformation of the 5th Legion into the White Scars required more than philosophical integration between Terran and Chogorian traditions. It demanded the complete reimagining of how Space Marines could wage war across the galaxy's vast theaters of operation. Jaghatai Khan's first priority involved analyzing the tactical limitations that had constrained his Legion's predecessors, identifying opportunities where Chogorian methods could provide decisive advantages over conventional Imperial approaches. The Khan recognized that speed and mobility, while valuable assets in any military campaign, could become overwhelming force multipliers when properly integrated with the advanced technology and superhuman capabilities of the Adeptus Astartes. The development of the White Scar's signature hit and run tactics began with careful study of the Legion's existing equipment and operational parameters. Traditional Space Marine doctrine emphasized the deployment of heavy infantry formations supported by armored vehicles and artillery, an approach that had proven effective in siege warfare and urban combat, but often struggled against mobile enemies or in campaigns requiring rapid territorial conquest. Jaghatai's analysis revealed that the Legion's existing equipment included substantial numbers of fast attack vehicles that had been underutilized in previous campaigns, relegated to reconnaissance roles rather than serving as primary combat platforms. The Khan's tactical innovations centered on the concept of the lightning strike, coordinated attacks that combined overwhelming speed with precise targeting to achieve maximum disruption of enemy forces before withdrawing to avoid retaliation. These operations required unprecedented levels of coordination between different unit types, as success depended on the ability to mass firepower at critical points while maintaining the mobility necessary for rapid disengagement. The development of these techniques demanded extensive modifications to existing training protocols and communication systems. The White Scar's preference for jet bikes emerged from Jaghatai's recognition that these vehicles represented the closest technological equivalent to the mounted warfare that had dominated Chogorian military tradition. The jet bike's combination of speed, maneuverability, and firepower made it an ideal platform for the kind of rapid strikes that the Khan envisioned, while its relatively small size allowed for deployment in terrain that would be inaccessible to larger vehicles. The Legion began requesting increased allocations of jet bikes from Mechanicum Forge worlds, often at the expense of heavier equipment that other legions considered essential. The integration of jet bikes into White Scar's tactical doctrine required significant adaptations to standard Imperial designs. Chogorian artificers working alongside Mechanicum tech, adepts developed modifications that enhanced the vehicle's reliability and range, recognizing that extended operations far from supply bases would be a constant feature of the Legion's campaigns. These improvements included enhanced fuel systems, reinforced chassis components, and upgraded communication equipment that allowed jet bike squadrons to coordinate effectively across vast distances. Land speeders represented another crucial component of the White Scar's evolving tactical approach, serving as mobile command platforms and heavy weapons carriers that could keep pace with jet bike formations while providing additional firepower and tactical flexibility. The Khan's forces pioneered new employment methods for these vehicles, using them not merely as reconnaissance assets, but as integral elements of combined arms formations that could engage a wide variety of enemy targets. The development of specialized land speeder variants equipped with enhanced sensors and communication systems allowed White Scar's commanders to maintain real-time awareness of battlefield conditions even during the most fluid engagements. The Legion's tactical evolution extended beyond individual vehicle types to encompass entirely new approaches to force organization and deployment. Traditional Space Marine companies were restructured to emphasize mobility and independence, with each unit receiving sufficient fast attack assets to operate autonomously across extended periods. This reorganization required careful attention to logistical considerations, as mobile formations consumed resources at rates that often exceeded the capabilities of conventional supply systems. The White Scars developed innovative solutions to these logistical challenges, including the use of high-speed supply drops and pre-positioned cache systems that allowed their forces to maintain operational tempo without relying on vulnerable supply convoys. These methods drew heavily on Chogorian traditions of living off the land and maintaining minimal logistical footprints, adapted to the technological requirements of interstellar warfare. The success of these approaches would later influence Imperial Guard doctrine and provide models for other Space Marine legions operating in similar environments. The compliance of Kolarn provided the first major test of the White Scars evolving tactical doctrines against a sophisticated enemy force. The Kolarn system contained 3 inhabited worlds dominated by a technologically advanced human civilization that had maintained independence through a combination of powerful defensive installations and a substantial fleet of system defense vessels. Previous Imperial compliance efforts had stalled against the system's layered defenses, with conventional assault tactics proving inadequate against enemies who possessed both the technology and tactical skill to counter traditional space marine methods. Jaghatai's approach to the Kolarn campaign demonstrated his understanding that speed could serve as both a tactical and strategic weapon. Rather than attempting to reduce the system's defenses through prolonged siege operations, the Khan proposed a series of simultaneous strikes against critical infrastructure targets across all 3 worlds. This strategy required precise timing and coordination between multiple task forces, each operating independently while contributing to the overall campaign objectives. The opening phase of the Kolarn compliance began with extensive reconnaissance operations conducted by White Scars jetbike squadrons operating from concealed positions in the system's outer asteroid belt. These forces spent weeks mapping enemy patrol patterns and identifying vulnerabilities in the defensive network, gathering intelligence that would prove crucial for the success of subsequent operations. The reconnaissance phase demonstrated the value of the Legion's enhanced mobility, as conventional space marine forces would have been unable to conduct such extensive intelligence-gathering operations without alerting the defenders. The primary assault commenced with coordinated strikes against orbital defense platforms and communication relays, executed by land speeder formations that had infiltrated the system using modified approach vectors that avoided detection by enemy sensors. These attacks achieved complete tactical surprise, destroying or disabling key defensive installations before enemy forces could mount effective responses. The success of these initial strikes created gaps in the defensive network that allowed follow-up forces to penetrate deeper into the system. The ground phase of the Kolarn campaign showcased the effectiveness of White Scars tactics against enemies who had prepared for conventional Imperial assault methods. Jetbike squadrons conducted lightning raids against command centers and supply depots, disrupting enemy coordination and logistics while avoiding direct confrontation with heavily fortified positions. These operations forced the defenders to disperse their forces across multiple potential targets, preventing them from concentrating sufficient strength to repel any single attack. The campaign's decisive moment came when White Scars forces succeeded in capturing the primary communication hub on Kolarn Prime, effectively blinding the system's defenders and preventing coordinated resistance across multiple worlds. This achievement required a complex operation involving simultaneous diversionary attacks and the precise timing of the main assault force's approach. The success of this operation demonstrated that properly executed mobility tactics could achieve strategic objectives that would have required vastly larger forces using conventional methods. The pacification of the Orc Empire of Goro presented different challenges that further tested the White Scars' tactical flexibility and operational capabilities. The Goro system contained multiple worlds dominated by Orc populations that had achieved an unusual degree of organization under the leadership of a particularly cunning warboss. Unlike human opponents who could be defeated through the destruction of key infrastructure or command systems, the Orcs required direct military confrontation that played to their considerable strengths in close combat and siege warfare. Jaghatai's analysis of the Goro situation revealed that conventional Imperial tactics would likely result in prolonged campaigns with heavy casualties, as Orc defensive positions were designed to channel attackers into killing zones where greenskin advantages in melee combat could prove decisive. The Khan's alternative approach focused on exploiting Orc psychological and tactical weaknesses, particularly their tendency toward aggressive pursuit of fleeing enemies and their difficulty maintaining coordination across extended operational areas. The Goro campaign began with a series of apparent probing attacks that were designed to appear unsuccessful, while actually gathering detailed intelligence about orc dispositions and response patterns. White Scar's jetbike squadrons conducted hit-and-run raids against outlying settlements, engaging orc forces just long enough to assess their capabilities before withdrawing in apparent defeat. These operations convinced the orc leadership that the Imperial forces were weak and disorganized, setting the stage for the campaign's later phases. The Khan's strategy exploited orc overconfidence by gradually drawing larger enemy forces away from their fortified positions through a series of escalating provocations. Each engagement was carefully calculated to inflict maximum casualties on orc forces, while appearing to represent desperate Imperial attempts to achieve tactical objectives. The cumulative effect of these operations was to convince the warboss that complete victory was imminent, leading him to commit his reserves to a massive offensive that would leave his primary strongholds vulnerable to counterattack. The climactic phase of the Goro campaign demonstrated the devastating effectiveness of coordinated White Scar's tactics against enemies who had been maneuvered into disadvantageous positions. While the majority of orc forces pursued what they believed to be retreating Imperial units, land speeder formations struck at the weakened defensive positions, protecting the primary orc settlements. These attacks achieved complete surprise and overwhelmed the reduced garrisons before reinforcements could respond effectively. The establishment of the Sajar Mazin represented one of Jaghatai Khan's most significant innovations in legion discipline and organization. This institution, whose name translated roughly as the Broken in the Chogorian tongue, provided a mechanism for dealing with space marines who had failed in their duties or violated legion codes of conduct, without resorting to the permanent solutions typically employed by other legions. The concept drew heavily on Chogorian traditions of exile and redemption, adapted to address the unique requirements of space marine psychology and imperial military necessity. The Sajar Mazin served multiple functions within White Scar's organization, operating simultaneously as a disciplinary measure, a source of specialized personnel for dangerous missions, and a pathway for the restoration of honor among disgraced warriors. Space Marines assigned to the Sajar Mazin were stripped of their normal unit affiliations and heraldry, marked instead with distinctive scarring that identified their status to other Legion members. These warriors were expected to seek redemption through exceptional valor in combat, with successful completion of assigned missions, potentially leading to restoration of their previous status. The practical implementation of the Sajar Mazin required careful balance between punishment and opportunity, as the institution needed to maintain its effectiveness as a disciplinary measure while providing genuine possibilities for redemption. The missions assigned to Sajar Mazin warriors were typically the most dangerous and difficult operations that the Legion faced, including deep reconnaissance behind enemy lines, suicide attacks against heavily fortified positions, and infiltration missions with minimal chances of survival. These assignments served both to test the commitment of disgraced warriors and to accomplish tactical objectives that would be impossible using conventional forces. The psychological aspects of the Sajar Mazin proved as important as its tactical applications, providing a mechanism for maintaining unit cohesion and morale, even when individual Space Marines failed to meet Legion standards. The knowledge that failure did not necessarily result in permanent disgrace or death allowed White Scar's warriors to take calculated risks and pursue aggressive tactics without fear that temporary setbacks would destroy their careers. This psychological freedom contributed significantly to the Legion's reputation for audacious operations and innovative tactical solutions. The cultural significance of the Sajar Mazin extended beyond its immediate disciplinary functions to encompass broader questions about honor, redemption, and the nature of warrior identity within the White Scar's Legion. The institution reflected Jagatai's understanding that even superhuman warriors could experience moments of weakness or failure, and that the Legion's long-term effectiveness required mechanisms for recovering from such setbacks, rather than simply discarding valuable personnel. This approach distinguished the White Scars from other legions that typically dealt with disciplinary problems through execution or permanent exile. The success of early White Scars campaigns, using these innovative tactics and organizational structures, established patterns that would characterize the Legion's operations throughout the Great Crusade. The combination of speed-based tactics, flexible organization, and unique disciplinary institutions created a military force that was particularly effective in campaigns requiring rapid territorial conquest or operations against mobile enemies. These capabilities would prove increasingly valuable as the Great Crusade expanded into regions where conventional imperial methods faced significant limitations. The relationships between the Primarchs represented one of the most complex and consequential aspects of the Great Crusade, as these demigod-like beings navigated bonds of brotherhood while commanding vast military forces across the galaxy. For Jaghatai Khan, these relationships proved particularly nuanced, shaped by his position as both an outsider to the political machinations that consumed many of his brothers and a respected voice of reason during moments of crisis. The Khan's approach to inter-Primarch relations reflected the same philosophical flexibility that characterized his military tactics, allowing him to maintain meaningful connections with brothers whose worldviews often differed dramatically from his own. The friendship between Jaghatai Khan and Magnus, the Red, stood as perhaps the most intellectually stimulating relationship among all the Primarchs, built upon shared fascination with knowledge that extended beyond the purely material realm. Both Primarchs possessed minds that refused to accept the limitations imposed by conventional thinking, though their approaches to expanding human understanding followed markedly different paths. Magnus pursued knowledge through systematic study of the warp and its manifold mysteries, while Jaghatai sought wisdom through the integration of shamanic traditions, with practical experience gained through decades of leadership and warfare. Their initial meeting occurred during the compliance of the Arc Reach cluster, where both the White Scars and Thousand Suns had been deployed to pacify a region containing multiple human civilizations that had developed sophisticated psychic traditions during the Age of Strife. The campaign required careful coordination between the two legions, as the enemy forces included powerful psychers whose abilities posed significant threats to conventional Imperial assault tactics. The operational necessities of the campaign provided numerous opportunities for the two Primarchs to engage in extended discussions about the nature of psychic phenomena and their proper role within Imperial doctrine. Magnus approached these conversations with the enthusiasm of a scholar who had finally found an intellectual equal capable of understanding the complexities of his research. The Crimson King had grown accustomed to his brother's dismissive attitudes toward his studies, with most Primarchs viewing his investigations into the warp as dangerous distractions from the practical requirements of military conquest. Jaghatai's willingness to engage seriously with these topics, combined with his own extensive experience with phenomena that defied materialist explanation, created a foundation for genuine intellectual exchange between the two. The Khan's perspective on psychic matters differed significantly from Magnus's systematic approach, drawing instead on the intuitive understanding developed through years of working with Chogorian shamans and storm seers. Where Magnus sought to categorize and control the forces of the warp through rigorous study and careful experimentation, Jaghatai emphasized the importance of maintaining harmony with powers that could not be fully comprehended or dominated. This fundamental difference in approach led to lengthy debates about the proper relationship between human consciousness and the immaterial realm. Their discussions extended beyond purely theoretical considerations to encompass practical questions about the deployment of psychic abilities in military operations. The Thousand Suns had developed sophisticated techniques for using sorcery as a weapon of war, creating formations of battle psychers capable of devastating enemy forces through direct manipulation of warp energies. The White Scars, by contrast, employed their storm seers primarily as guides and advisors, using their abilities to enhance conventional tactics rather than replace them entirely. Magnus often expressed frustration with what he perceived as Jaghatai's reluctance to fully embrace the potential of psychic power, arguing that the Khan's conservative approach represented a waste of humanity's greatest evolutionary advantage. The Crimson King believed that proper understanding and application of psychic abilities could solve many of the challenges facing the Great Crusade, from faster-than-light communication to the creation of weapons capable of destroying entire fleets. His vision encompassed a future where humanity would transcend its physical limitations through mastery of the warp's infinite possibilities. Jaghatai's responses to these arguments revealed the depth of his philosophical sophistication, as he challenged Magnus's assumptions about the nature of power and progress without dismissing the value of psychic abilities entirely. The Khan argued that the pursuit of absolute control over any force, whether material or immaterial, inevitably led to corruption and eventual destruction. His shamanic training had taught him that wisdom lay not in domination, but in understanding one's place within larger cosmic patterns, accepting the limitations that such understanding imposed. The relationship between the two Primarchs deepened during the campaign's later phases, as they worked together to develop strategies for countering enemy psychers without resorting to the wholesale slaughter that characterized many Imperial responses to psychic threats. Their collaboration resulted in innovative tactics that combined the Thousand Suns' offensive capabilities with the White Scar's mobility and the Storm Seer's defensive techniques. These joint operations demonstrated the potential benefits of intellectual cooperation between different Legion cultures, even when fundamental philosophical differences remained unresolved. The dynamic between Jaghatai Khan and Mortarion represented a far more contentious relationship, built upon fundamental disagreements about the nature of strength and the proper response to forces beyond human control. The two Primarchs had emerged from childhood experiences that shaped their worldviews in opposing directions, creating tensions that would persist throughout their service to the Emperor and ultimately influence their choices during the galaxy-spanning civil war that would tear the Imperium apart. Mortarion's hatred of Psychers and anything connected to the Warp stemmed from his traumatic experiences on Barbaros, where he had witnessed the devastating effects of uncontrolled psychic power wielded by the planet's necromantic overlords. The Death Lord's response to these experiences had been to reject all forms of supernatural influence, embracing a philosophy that valued physical resilience and technological solutions over what he viewed as dangerous reliance on unpredictable forces. His approach to warfare emphasized endurance and methodical advance, grinding down enemy resistance through superior discipline and equipment rather than seeking decisive victories through bold maneuvers. The Khan's integration of shamanic traditions into White Scar's doctrine represented everything that Mortarion found objectionable about his brother's approaches to leadership and warfare. The Death Lord viewed the Storm Seers as evidence of dangerous corruption within the Fifth Legion, arguing that any reliance on psychic abilities would inevitably lead to the kind of catastrophic failures that had characterized human civilization during the Age of Strife. His criticism of Jaghatai's methods often took the form of pointed questions about the reliability of tactics that depended on forces beyond rational understanding or direct control. Their philosophical differences extended beyond tactical considerations to encompass broader questions about human nature and the proper goals of the Great Crusade. Mortarion believed that humanity's survival required the complete elimination of all supernatural threats, including the systematic suppression of psychic abilities among human populations. His vision of imperial civilization emphasized uniformity and control, with standardized technologies and doctrines ensuring that no community could develop the kind of dangerous practices that had plagued humanity during previous eras of chaos and destruction. Jaghatai's response to these arguments revealed his understanding of the fundamental contradictions inherent in Mortarion's position. The Khan pointed out that the Death Lord's own supernatural abilities, along with those of all the Primarchs, represented exactly the kind of phenomena that his philosophy claimed to oppose. The Emperor himself wielded psychic powers that dwarfed anything possessed by the shamans and storm seers that Mortarion found so threatening. Yet the Death Lord had never questioned the legitimacy of his father's authority or the methods used to create the Primarchs themselves. The practical implications of their disagreement became apparent during joint operations, where both legions were deployed against enemies that possessed significant psychic capabilities. The Death Guard's tactical doctrine emphasized the use of overwhelming firepower and protective equipment to counter supernatural threats, accepting heavy casualties in exchange for the certainty that their methods would not be compromised by warp-based interference. The White Scars preferred to use their Storm Seer's abilities to anticipate and counter enemy psychic attacks, achieving similar results with far fewer losses, but requiring trust in abilities that Mortarion considered inherently unreliable. These operational differences led to heated exchanges between the two Primarchs about the proper balance between acceptable risk and tactical effectiveness. Mortarion argued that any strategy dependent on psychic abilities was fundamentally flawed, as the unpredictable nature of warp phenomena made it impossible to plan reliable operations around such capabilities. Jaghatai countered that the Death Lord's rigid adherence to purely material solutions often resulted in unnecessary casualties and missed opportunities, pointing to specific examples where Storm Seer guidance had prevented disasters or revealed tactical advantages that conventional reconnaissance would have missed. The tension between the two reached its peak during the compliance of the Melancholia system, where both legions were deployed against a human civilization that had developed extensive psychic defenses based on technologies that blended advanced science with warp manipulation. The enemy's capabilities posed unique challenges that required careful coordination between different Imperial forces, as conventional assault tactics proved ineffective against opponents who could predict and counter traditional military approaches through precognitive abilities. Mortarion's initial strategy involved systematic bombardment of all enemy installations, followed by methodical ground assault using Death Guard forces equipped with specialized protective gear designed to resist psychic attacks. This approach achieved limited success against outlying settlements, but stalled completely when applied to the system's primary fortress worlds, where the defenders' abilities allowed them to anticipate and prepare for each Imperial move. The resulting stalemate threatened to extend the campaign indefinitely, tying down substantial Imperial resources that were needed for other operations. Jaghatai's alternative approach involved using White Scar's mobility and Storm Seer abilities to conduct reconnaissance operations that mapped the enemy's psychic defenses, identifying weaknesses that could be exploited through carefully timed strikes. This intelligence revealed that the defenders' precognitive abilities were limited by their need to maintain concentration on specific areas, creating opportunities for simultaneous attacks that would overwhelm their capacity to respond effectively. The successful implementation of this strategy required precise coordination between conventional forces and psychic support, exactly the kind of integrated approach that Mortarion's philosophy rejected. The campaign's resolution through White Scar's methods vindicated Jaghatai's position, but failed to resolve the fundamental disagreement between the two Primarchs. Mortarion acknowledged the tactical success, while maintaining that such victories came at the cost of exposing Imperial forces to corruption and eventual destruction. The Death Lord's warnings about the dangers of psychic reliance would prove prophetic in ways that neither Primarch could have anticipated, as the galaxy-spanning civil war that would later engulf the Imperium would indeed be triggered by the catastrophic failure of psychic abilities and the corruption of those who wielded them. The Khan's role as mediator during inter-legion disputes emerged naturally from his reputation for fairness and his position outside the political factions that increasingly divided the Primarchs as the Great Crusade progressed. Unlike many of his brothers, Jaghatai had never sought to build coalitions or advance particular agendas within the broader Imperial hierarchy, focusing instead on the effective prosecution of his assigned campaigns and the welfare of his own legion. This independence, combined with his demonstrated ability to work effectively with Primarchs whose approaches differed dramatically from his own, made him a valuable voice during moments when tensions between different legions threatened to undermine imperial unity. The most significant example of Jaghatai's mediating role occurred during the dispute between Perturabo and Rogel Dorn over the proper approach to siege warfare and fortification design. The two Primarchs had developed increasingly bitter rivalry based on their competing philosophies about the relationship between offensive and defensive capabilities, with each claiming that his methods represented the superior approach to the challenges of modern warfare. Their disagreement had begun to affect the efficiency of joint operations, as both Primarchs refused to accept strategic plans that incorporated elements from their rivals' tactical doctrines. The Khan's intervention in this dispute demonstrated his understanding of the psychological dynamics that drove his brother's behavior, as well as his ability to identify practical solutions that addressed underlying concerns without requiring either party to abandon their fundamental principles. Jaghatai's analysis revealed that the conflict between Perturabo and Dorn stemmed not from genuine tactical disagreements, but from deeper issues related to recognition and respect within the imperial hierarchy. Both Primarchs felt that their contributions to the Great Crusade had been undervalued, leading them to compete for validation through increasingly extreme assertions of their own superiority. The resolution that Jaghatai proposed involved the creation of joint training exercises that would allow both Primarchs to demonstrate their capabilities without direct competition, while also providing opportunities for their forces to learn from each other's expertise. These exercises were structured to highlight the complementary nature of offensive and defensive capabilities, showing how effective siege operations required integration of both approaches rather than exclusive reliance on either methodology. The success of these joint operations helped restore working relationships between the Iron Warriors and Imperial Fists, while also providing valuable tactical innovations that benefited the broader Imperial military. The gathering storm clouds over the question of psychic powers within the Legion's Astartes reached their crescendo as the Emperor's summons echoed across the galaxy, calling all Primarchs to the world of Nicaea for what would become one of the most consequential assemblies in Imperial history. The Council of Nicaea emerged from mounting tensions between those who viewed psychic abilities as humanity's greatest evolutionary advantage, and those who saw them as an existential threat to the species' survival. For Jaghatai Khan, the approaching council represented a critical moment where his philosophical convictions would be tested against the political realities of an empire struggling to define its relationship with forces beyond the material realm. The White Scars Stormseers had become integral to the Legion's operational effectiveness, their abilities seamlessly woven into tactical doctrines that had proven successful across dozens of compliance campaigns. These warrior mystics represented a unique synthesis of Chogorian shamanic traditions with the standardized librarian training protocols developed on Terra, creating a cadre of psychic specialists whose capabilities extended far beyond the conventional parameters established by other legions. The Stormseers served not merely as battlefield assets, but as spiritual guides who helped maintain the cultural identity that distinguished the White Scars from their brother legions. The integration of shamanic practices into imperial military doctrine had required careful adaptation of ancient Chogorian traditions to meet the technological and organizational requirements of interstellar warfare. The storm-calling rituals that had once summoned weather patterns across the steppes of Chogoris were transformed into techniques for manipulating electromagnetic fields and atmospheric conditions on alien worlds. Divination practices that had guided tribal migrations through treacherous mountain passes became methods for anticipating enemy movements and identifying optimal strike vectors during fast-paced engagements. The Stormseers' training regimen combined elements from both traditions in ways that created capabilities unavailable to conventional librarians. Where standard Imperial psychic training emphasized control and standardization, the Chogorian approach valued intuition and adaptability, teaching practitioners to work with natural forces rather than attempting to dominate them completely. This philosophical difference manifested in practical applications, as Stormseers demonstrated remarkable ability to maintain their powers under conditions that would overwhelm psykers trained exclusively in Terran methods. The unique nature of Stormseer abilities had attracted attention from both supporters and critics of psychic integration within the Imperial military. Magnus, the Red, had expressed particular interest in their techniques, viewing the Chogorian approach as validation of his theories about the importance of cultural context in psychic development. The Crimson King had spent considerable time studying with White Scar's Stormseers during joint operations, documenting their methods and incorporating selected elements into Thousand Suns training protocols. Conversely, Primarchs like Mortarion viewed the Stormseers as evidence of dangerous deviation from approved Imperial doctrine, arguing that their integration of primitive superstitions with advanced psychic techniques created unpredictable variables that could compromise military operations. The Death Lord's criticism focused particularly on the shamanic elements of Stormseer training, which he claimed introduced corrupting influences that would inevitably lead to the kind of catastrophic failures that had plagued human civilization during the Age of Strife. The growing debate over psychic powers within the Legion's Astartes had been further complicated by reports of increasingly dangerous phenomena associated with warp-based abilities. Several legions had experienced incidents where psykers lost control of their powers, resulting in casualties among their own forces and raising questions about the reliability of psychic support in critical situations. These incidents provided ammunition for those advocating complete prohibition of psychic disciplines, while supporters argued that such problems resulted from inadequate training rather than inherent flaws in the abilities themselves. Jaghatai's preparation for the Council of Nicaea involved extensive consultation with his most experienced Stormseers, seeking to understand the full implications of the proposed restrictions on psychic abilities. The Khan recognized that the Council's decisions would affect not only the tactical capabilities of his legion, but also the cultural traditions that had shaped White Scar's identity since their integration of Chogorian elements. The potential loss of the Stormseers would represent more than a reduction in military effectiveness. It would constitute an attack on the philosophical foundations that distinguished his approach to leadership and warfare. The Khan's analysis of the situation revealed the complex political dynamics underlying the ostensibly technical debate about psychic safety and military effectiveness. The growing influence of certain Primarchs who opposed psychic integration reflected broader tensions within the imperial hierarchy about the proper balance between central control and local autonomy. The standardization advocates viewed the diversity of psychic traditions across different legions as a threat to imperial unity, while those supporting continued integration argued that such diversity represented a valuable source of tactical innovation and cultural strength. The journey to Nicaea provided Jaghatai with opportunities to gauge the positions of his brother Primarchs on the crucial questions that would dominate the Council's deliberations. Private conversations during the voyage revealed the depth of disagreement among the Emperor's sons, with some advocating complete prohibition of all psychic abilities, while others pushed for expanded integration of such powers into standard imperial doctrine. The Khan found himself increasingly isolated in his position that psychic abilities should be regulated rather than eliminated, requiring careful oversight without complete suppression. The world of Nicaea itself had been chosen for its symbolic significance as much as its practical suitability for hosting such a momentous gathering. The planet's history included extensive use of psychic abilities during its pre-imperial period, followed by a catastrophic collapse that had nearly destroyed its civilization when those powers were corrupted by warp entities. The ruins scattered across Nicaea's surface served as stark reminders of the potential consequences of uncontrolled psychic experimentation, providing a sobering backdrop for discussions about the proper role of such abilities within imperial society. The opening ceremonies of the Council of Nicaea demonstrated the Emperor's intention to treat the proceedings with the gravity befitting their potential impact on the future of human civilization. The Master of Mankind's presence lent ultimate authority to the gathering, while the assembled Primarchs represented the full spectrum of opinion on the questions under consideration. The formal structure of the proceedings, modeled on ancient Terran legal traditions, emphasized the importance of reasoned argument and evidence-based decision-making in resolving the fundamental questions about humanity's relationship with psychic phenomena. Jaghatai's testimony before the council represented one of the most eloquent defenses of regulated psychic integration delivered during the proceedings. The Khan's argument drew heavily on his experience with the Stormseers, presenting detailed evidence of their effectiveness in military operations, while acknowledging the legitimate concerns raised by those advocating stricter controls. His presentation emphasized the importance of proper training and cultural context in preventing the kind of catastrophic failures that had characterized uncontrolled psychic experimentation during previous eras. The Khan's defense of Magnus the Red during the council proceedings reflected both personal loyalty and principled conviction about the value of intellectual inquiry in advancing human understanding. Despite their philosophical differences about the proper approach to psychic phenomena, Jaghatai recognized that Magnus's research had produced genuine insights into the nature of warp-based abilities and their potential applications. The Khan argued that condemning such research would deprive humanity of valuable knowledge that could be crucial for survival in a galaxy filled with psychic threats. The specific arguments that Jaghatai presented in support of continued psychic integration focused on practical considerations rather than theoretical possibilities. The Khan cited numerous examples from White Scar's campaigns where Stormseer abilities had provided decisive advantages, from early warning of enemy ambushes to weather manipulation that had enabled successful operations under otherwise impossible conditions. These concrete demonstrations of psychic effectiveness contrasted sharply with the more speculative arguments presented by both extreme advocates and opponents of psychic integration. The Khan's testimony also addressed the cultural dimensions of the psychic debate, arguing that complete prohibition would require the suppression of traditions that had developed over millennia on worlds throughout the galaxy. The integration of local customs and beliefs had been a crucial element in the success of many compliance campaigns, as it allowed conquered populations to maintain their identity while accepting imperial authority. The elimination of psychic traditions would undermine this approach, potentially creating resistance that could destabilize entire sectors of the growing Imperium. The cross-examination that followed Jaghatai's formal testimony revealed the sophistication of his understanding of both the technical and political aspects of the psychic question. The Khan demonstrated detailed knowledge of the training methods used by different legions, the specific types of abilities that had proven most problematic, and the regulatory mechanisms that could address legitimate safety concerns without eliminating beneficial capabilities entirely. His responses to hostile questioning showed both the depth of his preparation and his commitment to finding practical solutions rather than ideological victories. The Emperor's final pronouncement at the Council of Nicaea represented a compromise that satisfied neither the strongest advocates nor the most determined opponents of psychic integration. The Edict of Nicaea established strict limitations on the use of psychic abilities within the Legion's Astartes while stopping short of complete prohibition, creating a regulatory framework that would govern the deployment of such powers throughout the remainder of the Great Crusade. The edict's specific provisions reflected many of the concerns that Jaghatai had raised during his testimony, though the overall restrictions were more severe than he had advocated. The immediate aftermath of the council saw widespread confusion among the legions as they struggled to implement the new restrictions while maintaining operational effectiveness. The White Scars faced particular challenges due to the integral role that Stormseers had played in their tactical doctrine, requiring significant modifications to established procedures and training protocols. The Khan's response to these challenges demonstrated his pragmatic approach to leadership, as he worked to find ways of complying with the edict's letter while preserving as much as possible of its spirit. The quiet defiance that characterized Jagatai's implementation of the Edict of Nicaea reflected his conviction that complete elimination of psychic abilities would ultimately prove counterproductive to imperial interests. The Khan's interpretation of the edict's provisions emphasized the distinction between prohibited offensive applications and permitted defensive uses, allowing his Stormseers to continue providing weather prediction, navigation assistance, and early warning capabilities that were essential for White Scar's operations. This approach required careful documentation to demonstrate compliance with imperial regulations while maintaining the practical benefits that psychic abilities provided. The continued employment of Stormseers within the White Scar's Legion required subtle modifications to their official roles and responsibilities, as the Khan worked to ensure that their activities remained within the bounds of permitted applications while preserving their effectiveness as military assets. The Stormseers were redesignated as Weather Readers and Terrain Specialists, titles that accurately described their functions while avoiding the psychic terminology that had become politically problematic following the Council of Nicaea. This semantic adjustment allowed the Legion to maintain its operational capabilities without openly challenging imperial authority. The training protocols for new Stormseer candidates were revised to emphasize the permitted aspects of their abilities, while de-emphasizing techniques that fell clearly within the prohibited categories. The shamanic elements of their education were reframed as cultural preservation activities rather than psychic training, allowing the continuation of practices that were essential for maintaining White Scar's identity. These adaptations required careful coordination between the Khan's senior officers and the Legion's most experienced Stormseers, as they worked to develop new approaches that would satisfy both regulatory requirements and operational necessities. The effectiveness of these adaptive measures became apparent during subsequent White Scar's campaigns, where the redesignated Stormseers continued to provide valuable support despite the formal restrictions on their activities. The Legion's performance in operations requiring rapid movement across difficult terrain or in adverse weather conditions remained superior to that of forces lacking similar capabilities, demonstrating that the practical benefits of psychic integration could be preserved even under restrictive regulatory frameworks. The success of these operations validated Jagatai's approach, while providing a model that other legions might have followed had political circumstances permitted such flexibility. The Khan's fascination with the ancient network of tunnels that threaded through the Immaterium began during the early years of the Great Crusade, when White Scar's reconnaissance forces encountered strange architectural anomalies on worlds that had supposedly been isolated since the Age of Strife. These discoveries, crystalline passages that seemed to exist partially outside normal space-time, doorways that led to chambers larger than the structures containing them, and corridors that connected points separated by impossible distances, represented phenomena that defied conventional imperial understanding of physics and engineering. Where other Primarchs might have dismissed such findings as Xeno's corruption requiring immediate purification, Jaghatai recognized the strategic implications of a transportation network that could potentially revolutionize imperial logistics and military deployment. The webway's existence had been suspected by imperial scholars since the early days of the Great Crusade, as fragmentary references in ancient Terran archives hinted at a galaxy-spanning network of passages that predated human interstellar civilization by millions of years. The Emperor himself possessed knowledge of this network, though he shared such information only with those he deemed capable of understanding its significance without being corrupted by its alien origins. Jaghatai's discovery of active webway nodes during White Scar's operations marked him as one of the few Primarchs trusted with deeper knowledge of humanity's ultimate strategic objectives. The collaboration between Jaghatai Khan and Magnus the Red in studying Xeno's technology extended far beyond their public discussions about psychic phenomena and imperial doctrine. Their private correspondence, conducted through carefully encrypted astropathic channels, revealed a shared understanding that the galaxy contained secrets whose importance transcended the immediate concerns of military conquest and planetary compliance. Both Primarchs had encountered evidence that the current phase of human expansion represented merely the latest iteration of cyclical patterns that had shaped galactic civilization for eons, with previous iterations leaving behind technological artifacts that could provide crucial advantages to those capable of understanding their function. Magnus's systematic approach to cataloging Xeno's artifacts complemented Jagatai's intuitive understanding of how such technologies might be integrated into practical applications. The Crimson King's extensive libraries on Prospero contained detailed analyses of archaeological sites discovered throughout the expanding Imperium, including comprehensive documentation of structures that displayed characteristics consistent with webway construction. These records, combined with intelligence gathered by White Scar's reconnaissance teams, created a comprehensive picture of the ancient network scope and current condition across multiple sectors of Imperial space. The archaeological expeditions that both Primarchs conducted on ancient Terran sites revealed the depth of pre-Imperial human knowledge about the webway and its strategic importance. Beneath the ruins of ancient cities, sealed vaults contained technical specifications and operational manuals that demonstrated sophisticated understanding of the network's function and maintenance requirements. These documents, written in archaic forms of Terran languages, describe the webway as humanity's intended pathway to galactic dominance, a tool that would allow human civilization to transcend the limitations imposed by conventional faster-than-light travel and establish permanent control over the galaxy's most strategically important locations. The discovery of these ancient records forced both Primarchs to reconsider their understanding of the Emperor's ultimate objectives for the Great Crusade. The Master of Mankind's insistence on rapid territorial expansion and the systematic elimination of Xeno's civilizations took on new significance when viewed as preparation for humanity's eventual mastery of the webway network. The current phase of conquest would establish the physical infrastructure necessary to support webway operations, while the elimination of potential rivals would prevent interference with humanity's ascension to galactic supremacy. Jagatai's first direct encounter with Dark Eldar raiders occurred during the compliance of the Calth system, where White Scar's forces had been deployed to pacify a collection of human settlements that had maintained technological independence through sophisticated defensive systems. The initial phases of the campaign proceeded according to standard Imperial doctrine, with reconnaissance teams mapping enemy positions while main assault forces prepared for coordinated strikes against key infrastructure targets. The sudden appearance of unknown Xeno's forces, emerging from concealed portals that materialized without warning, transformed a routine compliance operation into a complex multi-sided conflict that tested the limits of White Scar's tactical flexibility. The Xeno's attackers demonstrated capabilities that defied conventional understanding of battlefield dynamics, employing weapons that inflicted psychological as well as physical damage, while moving with speeds that challenged even the enhanced reflexes of Space Marines. Their vehicles seemed to operate according to principles that violated established laws of physics, changing direction instantaneously and accelerating to impossible velocities without apparent regard for momentum or inertia. Most disturbing of all, their tactics revealed intimate knowledge of Imperial military doctrine, suggesting extensive prior observation of Space Marine operations. The Dark Eldar's approach to warfare represented everything that the Khan found both fascinating and repugnant about Xeno's military philosophy. Their emphasis on speed and surprise aligned closely with White Scar's tactical preferences, but their obvious delight in inflicting suffering and their systematic harvesting of captives revealed a fundamental corruption that made any form of accommodation impossible. The Raiders' technology demonstrated clear superiority to Imperial equipment in several key areas, particularly in terms of mobility and stealth capabilities, yet their reliance on torture and terror as primary weapons indicated psychological weaknesses that could be exploited by properly prepared opponents. The campaign's progression revealed the raiders' connection to the mysterious portal network that Jaghatai had been investigating, as their ability to appear and disappear at will clearly depended on access to transportation methods that bypassed normal space entirely. The Khan's forces began focusing their efforts on locating and studying the portal's sites, recognizing that understanding the enemy's mobility advantages was crucial for developing effective countermeasures. This shift in tactical priorities required significant modifications to standard White Scars doctrine, as the Legion needed to adapt their traditional hit and run techniques to opponents who possessed even greater mobility advantages. The intelligence gathered during these operations provided the first concrete evidence of the webway's current inhabitants and their relationship to the ancient network's original creators. The Dark Eldar clearly possessed extensive knowledge of the system's operation, using it not merely as a transportation network, but as a base of operations from which they could launch raids across vast distances without warning. Their mastery of the technology exceeded anything that Imperial forces had achieved, suggesting either direct inheritance from the network's builders or millennia of practical experience with its operation. Jaghatai's hidden expeditions into the webway itself began as tactical reconnaissance missions designed to gather intelligence about Dark Eldar capabilities and operational patterns. The Khan personally led small teams of his most trusted warriors through captured portal sites, using modified equipment designed to function in the network's unique environment. These early incursions revealed the true scope of the ancient construction, as the explorers discovered passages that stretched across distances that would require months of warp travel to traverse through conventional means. The physical environment within the webway defied easy description, combining architectural elements that seemed to shift between different design philosophies without apparent pattern or logic. Corridors constructed from crystalline materials that pulsed with their own internal light-connected chambers built from metals that displayed no signs of age despite their obvious antiquity. The geometry of the passages themselves seemed to operate according to principles that challenged human spatial perception, with routes that appeared to curve back upon themselves actually leading to destinations thousands of light years distant from their starting points. The inhabitants that the Khan's forces encountered during these expeditions included not only the Dark Eldar raiders, but also other entities whose nature and origin remained mysterious. Automated defense systems of clearly Xenos manufacture continued to function after eons of apparent abandonment, suggesting that the network's original builders had incorporated self-maintenance capabilities that exceeded anything in the Imperial technological repertoire. More disturbing were the encounters with creatures that seemed to exist partially outside normal space-time, beings whose presence caused reality itself to become unstable in ways that reminded Jaghatai uncomfortably of phenomena associated with warp incursions. The knowledge accumulated through these dangerous expeditions fundamentally altered Jaghatai's understanding of humanity's place within galactic civilization. The evidence suggested that the current configuration of intelligent species represented merely the latest phase in cycles of rise and decline that had repeated themselves across cosmic time scales. Previous dominant civilizations had achieved technological capabilities that dwarfed anything possessed by contemporary powers, yet all had ultimately fallen to forces that their mastery of material science could not overcome. The implications of this revelation extended far beyond military or technological considerations to encompass fundamental questions about the nature of existence and consciousness in a universe where immaterial forces could override physical laws. The webway itself represented an attempt to transcend these limitations, creating a realm where thought and will could shape reality more directly than in normal space. Yet even this achievement had not prevented the network's builders from succumbing to whatever catastrophe had reduced their galaxy spanning civilization to scattered ruins and automated systems. The strategic importance of webway access became increasingly apparent as Jaghatai's understanding of the network's capabilities expanded. Control of key nodes could provide decisive advantages in any large-scale conflict, allowing forces to redeploy across vast distances without the delays and risks associated with warp travel. The network's apparent immunity to the chaotic influences that plagued conventional faster-than-light transportation made it an invaluable asset for maintaining communication and coordination across an empire spanning multiple galactic sectors. The Khan's growing expertise in webway navigation and the tactical applications of portal technology created new possibilities for White Scar's operations that went far beyond their traditional role as rapid assault forces. Small teams could be deployed to conduct reconnaissance missions across multiple star systems simultaneously, gathering intelligence that would require entire fleets to obtain through conventional means. Strategic strikes could be launched against targets that were supposedly protected by distance and defensive installations, as webway access allowed attackers to bypass traditional approaches entirely. The development of specialized equipment and techniques for webway operations required extensive cooperation between White Scar's artificers and selected Mechanicum tech adepts who had been cleared for access to the most sensitive Imperial research projects. The unique environmental conditions within the network demanded modifications to standard Space Marine equipment, as conventional life support systems proved inadequate for extended operations in spaces where the normal laws of physics operated inconsistently. The creation of these specialized systems provided valuable insights into the fundamental principles underlying the network's construction, though full understanding remained frustratingly elusive. The security measures that Jaghatai implemented around his webway research reflected his understanding of the knowledge's potential for both benefit and catastrophe if it fell into the wrong hands. Access to information about the expeditions was restricted to a small circle of trusted officers who had demonstrated both exceptional loyalty and the psychological stability necessary to process revelations that challenged fundamental assumptions about reality. Even within this inner circle, knowledge was compartmentalized to ensure that no single individual possessed complete understanding of the Khan's discoveries and their implications. The philosophical implications of webway exploration forced Jaghatai to confront questions about the relationship between knowledge and wisdom that had shaped his approach to leadership since his earliest days on Chogoris. The network represented power on a scale that could reshape galactic civilization, yet the fate of its builders served as a stark reminder that technological advancement alone provided no guarantee of survival or prosperity. The shamanic traditions of his adopted world had taught him to view such power with caution, recognizing that forces beyond human comprehension demanded respect rather than attempts at domination. The balance between exploitation and preservation that characterized Jaghatai's approach to webway research reflected these deeper philosophical concerns about humanity's proper relationship with technologies that transcended current understanding. The Khan recognized that hasty attempts to fully utilize the network's capabilities could result in catastrophic failures that would dwarf any temporary advantages gained through access to its transportation systems. The measured pace of his investigations prioritized safety and understanding over rapid deployment of new capabilities, even when such restraint meant foregoing potential tactical advantages in ongoing campaigns. The isolation that had long characterized the White Scar's operational methods became a strategic liability as the galaxy erupted into civil war during the opening months of what would become known as the Horus Heresy. While other legions received immediate notification of Horus's betrayal through established communication networks and direct contact with Terran command structures, the 5th Legion found itself scattered across the galaxy's eastern fringe, engaged in campaigns that had deliberately taken them far from the political centers of imperial power. This geographic dispersal, combined with the Khan's preference for maintaining operational independence, meant that the White Scars remained unaware of the catastrophic events unfolding at Istvan for crucial weeks after the massacre had already reshaped the strategic balance of the Great Crusade. The first indications that something had gone catastrophically wrong reached Jaghatai through fragmentary astropathic transmissions that spoke of betrayal and civil war, in terms so extreme that many White Scar's commanders initially dismissed them as enemy disinformation or the ravings of psychers driven mad by warp exposure. The concept that Horus Lupercal, the Emperor's most trusted son and the appointed warmaster of all imperial forces, could have turned against his father seemed so fundamentally impossible that it challenged the basic assumptions upon which the entire Great Crusade had been built. The Khan's immediate response was to order increased security protocols while attempting to establish direct communication with Terra, seeking confirmation of reports that seemed to describe the collapse of everything he had spent decades helping to build. The communication blackout that followed these initial fragmentary reports created an information vacuum that left the White Scar's leadership struggling to understand the true scope of the crisis facing the Imperium. Standard astropathic channels carried only garbled transmissions that raised more questions than they answered, while attempts to establish contact with other Legion forces met with either complete silence or messages that contradicted each other so fundamentally that determining the truth became impossible. The Khan found himself in the unprecedented position of commanding a legion that was effectively cut off from the broader Imperial command structure at the moment when unity and coordination were most desperately needed. The strategic implications of this isolation extended far beyond simple communication difficulties to encompass fundamental questions about the White Scar's role in whatever conflict was developing across the galaxy. Without clear intelligence about which forces remained loyal to the Emperor and which had joined Horus's rebellion, any major redeployment of Legion assets risked walking into traps or inadvertently supporting the wrong side in a civil war whose battle lines remained unclear. The Khan's natural caution, honed through decades of operating in uncertain tactical environments, led him to maintain current operational commitments while gathering intelligence about the broader situation. The Battle of Prospero's aftermath provided the first concrete evidence of the scale of destruction that had already been unleashed across the Imperium. Fragmentary reports reaching the White Scars described the complete devastation of Magnus, the Red's homeworld, and the apparent annihilation of the Thousand Suns Legion by Leman Russ and his space wolves. The initial accounts of this catastrophe painted it as a necessary response to treachery by Magnus, claiming that the Crimson King had violated the Edict of Nicaea so egregiously that immediate military action had been required to prevent even greater disasters. Jaghatai's reaction to these reports reflected both his personal relationship with Magnus and his understanding of the political dynamics that had shaped the Council of Nicaea's aftermath. The Khan had maintained private correspondence with the Crimson King throughout the years following the Council, and nothing in their exchanges had suggested the kind of fundamental corruption that would justify the complete destruction of Prospero. Magnus's continued commitment to advancing human knowledge and his careful adherence to the letter of the edict's restrictions, if not always its spirit, seemed incompatible with the treachery described in the official reports reaching White Scar's command elements. The investigation that Jaghatai ordered into the true events surrounding Magnus's fall required careful coordination between multiple White Scar's intelligence assets and the Khan's personal network of contacts throughout the imperial bureaucracy. The fragmentary evidence that emerged from this investigation painted a picture far more complex than the official narrative suggested, revealing layers of miscommunication, political manipulation, and deliberate deception that had transformed what should have been a measured response to regulatory violations into a campaign of total annihilation. The role of the Council of Terra in authorizing the assault on Prospero became a particular focus of the Khan's investigation, as the speed with which the operation had been approved and executed suggested either extraordinary efficiency or predetermined conclusions that had little to do with Magnus's actual actions. The official justification for the attack centered on claims that the Thousand Suns had been corrupted by warp entities and posed an immediate threat to imperial security, yet the evidence supporting these accusations remained suspiciously vague and largely classified at levels that prevented independent verification. The discovery that Horus himself had played a crucial role in directing the Space Wolves toward Prospero fundamentally altered Jaghatai's understanding of the events leading up to the current crisis. The War Master's involvement suggested that Magnus's destruction had been part of a larger strategic plan rather than a spontaneous response to immediate threats, indicating a level of premeditation that cast doubt on the official narrative of the heresy's origins. The Khan began to suspect that the civil war had not begun with Horus's sudden betrayal at Istvan, but had been developing for months or even years through careful manipulation of existing tensions between different legions and their primarchs. The conflicting reports about the current status of various legions created an intelligence puzzle that challenged the White Scar's analytical capabilities, while highlighting the extent to which the rebellion had already disrupted Imperial command structures. Some sources claimed that entire legions had declared for Horus, while others insisted that the same forces remained loyal to the Emperor. The systematic nature of these contradictions suggested deliberate disinformation campaigns designed to prevent loyal forces from coordinating effective responses to the rebellion, yet determining which reports were accurate and which were enemy propaganda proved nearly impossible without independent verification. The Khan's response to this information warfare campaign reflected his understanding that making premature commitments based on incomplete intelligence could prove catastrophic for both his legion and the broader imperial cause. Rather than declaring immediate allegiance to either side in the developing conflict, Jaghatai ordered his forces to maintain operational security while continuing their assigned missions, buying time for more reliable intelligence to emerge while avoiding actions that could not be reversed if the situation changed. This cautious approach frustrated many White Scar's officers who wanted to take immediate action against the traitors, but the Khan's experience with the complexities of tribal warfare on Chogoris had taught him the value of patience when dealing with conflicts where the true battle lines remained unclear. The Kandak's campaign represented both the culmination of the White Scar's pre-heresy operational methods and a bitter irony that would haunt Jaghatai for years afterward. The massive Orc empire that had established itself across multiple systems in the Kandak sector posed exactly the kind of threat that the Legion had been designed to counter, with greenskin forces whose mobility and aggressive tactics demanded the rapid response capabilities that were the White Scar's greatest strength. The campaign's strategic importance was undeniable, as Orc expansion threatened to destabilize an entire sector and potentially create a launching point for Wa incursions that could devastate dozens of Imperial worlds. The irony lay in the timing of the deployment, as the Khan's forces found themselves committed to a protracted campaign against Xeno's enemies, just as the Imperium tore itself apart in civil war. The Kandak's operations had been planned and authorized during the final months of apparent Imperial unity, when the greatest threats to human civilization seemed to come from external enemies rather than internal divisions. The campaign's duration and the difficulty of extracting forces once combat had begun meant that the White Scars would remain tied down fighting Orcs, while their brother legions slaughtered each other across the galaxy. The scale of Orc forces in the Kandak sector exceeded initial Imperial intelligence estimates by orders of magnitude, revealing a level of organization and strategic planning that challenged conventional understanding of greenskin capabilities. The Orc Empire's leadership structure included multiple war bosses who had managed to maintain cooperation across vast distances, coordinating their forces' movements in ways that suggested either unprecedented discipline among the greenskins or external guidance from unknown sources. The discovery of sophisticated fortifications and advanced weaponry among Orc forces raised disturbing questions about how these traditionally chaotic enemies had achieved such impressive military capabilities. The White Scar's initial operations in the Kandak sector followed established patterns for anti-Orc campaigns, with jet bike squadrons conducting reconnaissance missions, while land speeder formations prepared strike packages against identified command centers and supply concentrations. The Legion's speed advantages proved decisive in the campaign's opening phases, as White Scar's forces repeatedly achieved tactical surprise against Orc positions that had been designed to counter conventional Imperial assault methods. The success of these early operations created optimism that the campaign would conclude quickly, allowing the Legion to redeploy to address whatever crisis was developing elsewhere in the galaxy. The Orcs' adaptive response to White Scar's tactics demonstrated a level of strategic thinking that forced significant modifications to established Legion doctrine. The Greenskins began deploying their own fast attack formations, using captured Imperial vehicles and improvised speed machines to challenge the White Scar's mobility advantages. More disturbing was evidence that Orc forces were receiving intelligence about Legion operational patterns, allowing them to prepare ambushes and countermeasures that targeted specific White Scar's tactical preferences. The source of this intelligence remained unclear, but its accuracy suggested either extensive prior observation of Legion operations or active collaboration between the Orcs and other hostile forces. The brutal nature of the fighting in the Kondak sector reflected both the Orcs' inherent savagery and the strategic importance that both sides placed on controlling the region's key systems. Battles that should have been decided through rapid maneuver warfare devolved into prolonged sieges, as Orc fortifications proved more resilient than expected, while Greenskin counterattacks demonstrated coordination and tactical sophistication that challenged White Scar's assumptions about enemy capabilities. The casualty rates from these engagements exceeded anything the Legion had experienced during previous campaigns, forcing difficult decisions about resource allocation and tactical priorities. The Khan's growing frustration with the Kondak's deployment reflected his awareness that each day spent fighting Orcs was a day lost in addressing the crisis that was consuming the broader Imperium. Intelligence reports continued to arrive describing escalating violence between different Legion forces, with entire star systems changing hands as the Civil War expanded beyond its original theaters of operation. The strategic balance that had maintained Imperial unity was collapsing, yet the White Scars remained committed to a campaign against enemies who posed no direct threat to Terra or the Emperor's survival. The psychological impact of this forced inaction affected the entire Legion, as warriors who had joined the Great Crusade to unite humanity found themselves fighting Xenos, while their brother Space Marines died in fratricidal combat. The traditional White Scar's emphasis on speed and decisive action made the prolonged nature of the Kondak's operations particularly frustrating, as the Legion's tactical preferences were poorly suited to the grinding attritional warfare that the campaign had become. Morale problems began to emerge among units that had previously maintained exceptional discipline, with reports of unauthorized actions and breaches of operational security that reflected the stress of their impossible situation. The intelligence network that Jaghatai had developed through years of independent operations provided fragmentary updates about the heresy's progression, but these reports often raised more questions than they answered about the true state of the conflict. The destruction of multiple Legion homeworlds, the apparent corruption of Primarchs who had previously been considered beyond reproach, and the systematic breakdown of Imperial command structures painted a picture of catastrophe on a scale that challenged comprehension. The Khan found himself struggling to process information that suggested the complete failure of everything the Great Crusade had sought to achieve. The reports describing the Emperor's own involvement in direct combat operations provided perhaps the most disturbing intelligence reaching the White Scars during this period. The Master of Mankind's emergence from the seclusion that had characterized his recent years suggested that the crisis had reached levels that required his personal intervention, yet the fragmentary nature of the reports made it impossible to determine whether his involvement represented strength or desperation. The possibility that even the Emperor might be struggling to contain the rebellion's expansion created profound uncertainty about the ultimate outcome of the Civil War and the survival of the Imperium itself. The difficult choice between loyalty to Horus as War Master and loyalty to the Emperor became increasingly complex as more information reached the Khan about the rebellion's true nature and scope. The initial reports had suggested a clear division between loyal and traitor forces, but the reality proved far more complicated, with different factions claiming legitimacy while accusing their opponents of betraying fundamental imperial principles. The Khan's investigation into these competing claims revealed that both sides had committed actions that seemed to violate the oaths and traditions that had previously guided Space Marine conduct. The evidence of chaos corruption among some of the rebel forces provided the clearest indication of which side represented the greater threat to human civilization, yet even this intelligence came filtered through sources whose reliability remained questionable. The descriptions of demon manifestations and reality warping phenomena associated with certain traitor legions seemed almost too extreme to be credible, yet they aligned with theoretical knowledge about warp entities that the Khan had acquired through his studies of Xeno's technology and ancient Terran archives. The possibility that the rebellion had been influenced or directed by forces from beyond the material realm added another layer of complexity to an already impossible situation. The revelation of Horus's treachery struck Jaghatai Khan like a thunderbolt across the steppes of his homeworld, shattering the careful equilibrium he had maintained between loyalty to the War Master and devotion to the Emperor. The fragmentary intelligence reports that had trickled through compromised astropathic channels finally coalesced into an undeniable truth. The Imperium's greatest champion had turned against everything he had once sworn to protect. The confirmation came through multiple independent sources that the Khan had cultivated throughout his years of operating on the galaxy's periphery, each corroborating the same horrific narrative of betrayal at Istvan V and the systematic corruption of legions that had once stood as humanity's greatest defenders. The decision to commit fully to the loyalist cause required Jaghatai to abandon the careful neutrality he had maintained while gathering intelligence about the Civil War's true nature. The Khan's analysis of the available evidence left no room for doubt about which side represented the greater threat to human civilization. The reports of demon manifestations among traitor forces, the systematic destruction of imperial worlds that refused to submit to Horus's authority, and the corruption of space marines into something fundamentally inhuman all pointed toward influences that transcended mere political rebellion. The Emperor's vision of human unity and progress, however flawed in its implementation, remained preferable to the chaos and destruction that seemed to follow in the War Master's wake. The personal cost of this commitment weighed heavily on the Khan's mind as he prepared to extract his forces from the Kondax campaign. Years of correspondence with Magnus, the Red had created bonds of intellectual friendship that transcended the political divisions among the Primarchs, yet the Crimson King's apparent allegiance to Horus meant that these relationships would likely end in violence. The philosophical discussions about the nature of knowledge and power that had enriched both Primarchs' understanding of their roles within the Great Crusade now seemed like preparations for an inevitable confrontation where one brother would be forced to destroy another. The strategic situation in the Kondax sector had deteriorated significantly during the months that the White Scars had been committed to anti-Orc operations, with Greenskin forces adapting their tactics to counter Legion mobility advantages while receiving mysterious support that enhanced their technological capabilities far beyond normal parameters. The Orc Empire's leadership structure had evolved into something approaching genuine military organization, with different warbosses coordinating their forces' movements in ways that suggested external guidance from sources whose identity remained frustratingly unclear. The campaign that should have concluded within weeks had transformed into a grinding war of attrition that consumed resources desperately needed for the broader conflict consuming the Imperium. The Khan's orders for immediate withdrawal from Kondax operations met with fierce resistance from several senior White Scars commanders, who argued that abandoning the campaign would leave entire sectors vulnerable to Orc expansion. Captain Chinza, one of the Legion's most respected tactical theorists, presented detailed analyses showing how premature withdrawal could create strategic vulnerabilities that would require years to address once the Civil War concluded. The arguments possessed considerable merit, as the Orc forces had demonstrated capabilities that posed genuine threats to Imperial worlds throughout the region, Yet Jaghatai recognized that such considerations had become secondary to the existential crisis facing human civilization. The extraction process itself proved far more complex than standard imperial doctrine anticipated, as the White Scars discovered that their enemies had anticipated potential withdrawal attempts and prepared countermeasures designed to trap Legion forces within the combat zone. Orc formations that had previously focused on defensive operations suddenly launched coordinated offensives against key transportation hubs and orbital facilities, while previously unknown enemy assets emerged from concealment to threaten the evacuation routes that White Scars planners had identified as secure. The systematic nature of these countermeasures suggested intelligence capabilities that exceeded anything the Greenskins should have possessed independently. The first indication that Alpha Legion forces were operating in the Kondax sector came through intercepted communications that used encryption methods far too sophisticated for Orc technology, combined with tactical coordination that displayed the kind of strategic thinking that characterized Space Marine operations rather than Greenskin warfare. The 20th Legion's involvement explained many of the anomalies that had plagued the White Scars throughout their deployment: the enemy's uncanny ability to anticipate Legion movements, the appearance of advanced weaponry among supposedly primitive forces, and the level of strategic coordination that had transformed what should have been a routine compliance operation into a protracted campaign. The Alpha Legion's methods of warfare represented everything that Jaghatai found philosophically objectionable about certain approaches to military conflict, emphasizing deception and manipulation over the direct confrontation that characterized traditional Space Marine tactics. Their willingness to work with Xeno's forces violated fundamental principles that had guided Imperial expansion since the Great Crusade's inception, while their systematic use of misinformation and psychological warfare created environments where determining truth from falsehood became nearly impossible. The discovery of their involvement forced the Khan to reconsider every aspect of the Kondax operations, questioning whether any of the intelligence his forces had gathered could be trusted. The running battles that characterized the White Scars fighting withdrawal from Kondax demonstrated both the Legion's tactical flexibility and the sophisticated nature of the opposition they faced. Alpha Legion forces employed hit-and-run tactics that mirrored White Scars' preferences, while possessing intimate knowledge of 5th Legion operational patterns that allowed them to anticipate and counter many traditional responses. The resulting engagements required constant adaptation of established procedures, as techniques that had proven successful in previous campaigns became predictable and therefore vulnerable to enemy countermeasures. The psychological warfare component of the Alpha Legion's operations proved particularly insidious, as their agents had infiltrated Orc forces at multiple levels while simultaneously spreading disinformation designed to undermine White Scars' morale and unit cohesion. Intercepted communications contained carefully crafted messages that played on existing tensions within the Legion, exploiting the cultural differences between Terran and Chogorian elements while amplifying doubts about the Khan's leadership decisions. The sophistication of these psychological operations suggested extensive prior study of White Scars' organizational dynamics and individual personality profiles among key officers. The void warfare aspects of the extraction proved equally challenging, as Alpha Legion naval assets had positioned themselves to interdict the most direct routes toward Terra while maintaining sufficient concealment to avoid decisive engagement with White Scars' fleet elements. The 20th Legion's ships employed stealth technologies and unconventional tactics that made tracking their movements extremely difficult, forcing White Scars navigators to plot circuitous courses that added weeks to journey times while consuming fuel reserves that had been calculated for more direct approaches. The cumulative effect of these delays threatened to prevent the Legion from reaching Terra before the decisive phases of the Civil War concluded. The internal strife that erupted within the White Scars during the withdrawal period reflected deeper tensions about the Legion's proper role in the developing conflict and the wisdom of abandoning ongoing operations to pursue uncertain objectives across the galaxy. Torgun Khan, one of the most senior Chogorian officers and a veteran of the original tribal unification campaigns, emerged as the focal point for opposition to Jaghatai's decision to support the Emperor against Horus. His arguments drew on traditional Chogorian concepts of loyalty and obligation, suggesting that the War Master's authority as appointed commander of all Imperial forces created binding commitments that transcended personal preferences or political considerations. Torgun's faction within the Legion represented approximately one-third of the White Scar's senior leadership, including several company commanders whose tactical expertise and personal courage had been proven through decades of successful operations. Their opposition to the Khan's decision was not based on sympathy for Horus's rebellion, but on genuine conviction that supporting the Emperor against his appointed representative violated fundamental principles of military hierarchy and personal honor. The philosophical sophistication of their arguments forced Jaghatai to engage in extensive debates about the nature of loyalty and the proper response to situations where different obligations came into conflict. The resolution of this internal crisis required all of the Khan's diplomatic skills and his deep understanding of Chogorian cultural dynamics, as simple assertions of authority would have been insufficient to convince warriors whose objections were based on principled conviction rather than mere insubordination. Jaghatai's approach involved systematic examination of the evidence regarding Horus's corruption and the influence of chaos entities on the rebellion's leadership, presenting intelligence that demonstrated how the War Master's transformation had fundamentally altered the nature of his authority. The revelation that demons had manifested on worlds controlled by traitor forces provided the clearest indication that the rebellion represented something far more dangerous than a conventional political dispute. The Khan's presentation of evidence regarding Magnus, the Red's fate, proved particularly effective in convincing skeptical officers that the rebellion's true nature transcended normal military or political considerations. The systematic destruction of Prospero and the apparent annihilation of the Thousand Suns demonstrated the kind of total warfare that characterized conflicts involving chaos corruption, where compromise and negotiation became impossible due to the fundamental incompatibility between human civilization and the forces seeking to destroy it. The personal relationships that many White Scar's officers had maintained with their counterparts in other legions made the evidence of fratricidal violence particularly compelling. The gradual conversion of Torgun's faction to support for the loyalist cause reflected both the persuasive power of the evidence and the cultural mechanisms that Chogorian society had developed for resolving disputes between competing obligations. The shamanic traditions that continued to influence White Scar's thinking included concepts of spiritual corruption that provided frameworks for understanding how external influences could fundamentally alter an individual's nature, making previous commitments void if the person to whom loyalty was owed had been transformed into something else entirely. The application of these traditional concepts to the question of Horus's rebellion allowed skeptical officers to maintain their honor while acknowledging the necessity of opposing their former commander. The journey toward Terra required navigation through multiple war zones where the distinction between loyal and traitor forces remained unclear, forcing White Scar's fleet elements to approach each system with extreme caution while maintaining readiness for immediate combat if threatened. The breakdown of Imperial communication networks meant that standard identification protocols could not be trusted, as both sides in the conflict possessed the technical capabilities necessary to forge authentication codes and impersonate legitimate Imperial units. The resulting uncertainty created situations where potential allies might be mistaken for enemies, while actual hostile forces could achieve surprise by appearing to be friendly units requesting assistance. The series of engagements that marked the White Scar's progress toward the Sol system demonstrated the Legion's ability to adapt their tactical doctrines to the unique challenges posed by Civil War operations. Traditional approaches to void combat and planetary assault had been developed for use against Xeno's enemies or non-compliant human civilizations, but fighting against other Space Marine forces required different techniques that accounted for opponents who possessed equivalent training, equipment, and tactical knowledge. The resulting battles often hinged on factors such as crew experience, ship maintenance standards, and the psychological effects of fighting former allies rather than the technological advantages that typically determined outcomes in conventional warfare. The White Scar's reputation for speed and mobility proved to be both an advantage and a liability during these operations, as their approach patterns were well known to other Imperial forces, but could also be exploited by enemies who understood Legion tactical preferences. The Khan's response involved systematic modification of established procedures, introducing variations and innovations that maintained operational effectiveness while reducing predictability. These adaptations required extensive retraining of personnel who had spent years perfecting specific techniques, creating additional stress on units already struggling with the psychological challenges of civil war. The intelligence gathered during the journey toward Terra painted an increasingly dire picture of the Imperium's strategic situation, with reports indicating that traitor forces had achieved significant territorial gains, while loyal legions struggled to coordinate effective responses to the rebellion's expansion. The systematic nature of the traitors' initial successes suggested careful planning that had begun long before the open rebellion at Istvan, with key Imperial installations and communication hubs targeted for capture or destruction in ways that maximized disruption to loyal forces' ability to respond effectively. The scope of this preparation indicated that the rebellion represented far more than a spontaneous uprising triggered by immediate grievances. The evidence of chaos corruption among traitor forces became increasingly undeniable as the White Scars encountered refugees and survivors from worlds that had fallen under rebel control. The testimonies of these witnesses described phenomena that defied rational explanation: Space Marines whose physical forms had been twisted into inhuman configurations, reality warping effects that transformed familiar environments into nightmare landscapes, and the manifestation of entities whose very presence caused madness among normal humans. The consistency of these accounts across multiple independent sources provided compelling evidence that the rebellion had been influenced or directed by forces from beyond the material realm. The psychological impact of this revelation affected the entire Legion, as warriors who had joined the Great Crusade to advance human civilization found themselves confronting enemies who sought to destroy the very concept of rational existence. The traditional White Scar's emphasis on speed and decisive action took on new urgency when applied to conflicts where delay could allow chaos corruption to spread and strengthen. The Khan's emphasis on maintaining cultural traditions and spiritual practices gained additional significance as methods for preserving human identity against influences that sought to transform humanity into something fundamentally alien. The final approach to the Sol system required navigation through defensive networks that had been designed to protect Terra from external invasion, but now served as obstacles preventing loyal forces from reaching the Emperor's side. The systematic fortification of the system's outer reaches reflected preparations for siege warfare on a scale that dwarfed anything previously attempted in human history, with defensive installations capable of destroying entire fleets positioned to cover all major approach routes. The White Scar's arrival at the edge of this defensive network marked the end of their long journey from the galaxy's periphery and the beginning of their participation in the climactic battles that would determine the Imperium's fate. The White Scar's arrival in the Sol system coincided with the final preparations for what would become the most devastating siege in human history. The Khan's fleet emerged from the warp at the system's edge to find Terra's orbital defenses bristling with weapons platforms and void shields that transformed the cradle of humanity into an impregnable fortress. The sight of Luna's surface, scarred by massive construction projects, and the asteroid belt converted into a network of defensive stations, demonstrated the scale of preparation that had consumed the Imperium's heartland during the months of civil war. Jaghatai's forces had traveled across half the galaxy to reach this moment, leaving behind the endless campaigns against orcs and Alpha Legion infiltrators to join the desperate defense of humanity's birth world. The integration of White Scar's forces into Terra's defensive network required rapid adaptation to siege warfare conditions that differed fundamentally from the mobile campaigns that had defined the Legion's operational doctrine. The massive defensive installations surrounding the Imperial Palace demanded static defensive positions and coordinated artillery barrages rather than the lightning strikes and rapid redeployment that characterized traditional White Scar's tactics. Rogaldorn's systematic approach to fortification had created defensive lines that stretched across entire continents, with each sector requiring thousands of defenders to maintain adequate coverage against the overwhelming numbers of traitor forces preparing to assault the world. The Khan's initial meetings with his loyalist brothers revealed the desperate nature of Terra's strategic situation. Sanguinius commanded the aerial defenses with his Blood Angels, their mastery of three-dimensional combat proving essential for countering the traitor fleet's attempts to establish orbital superiority. Rogaldorn's Imperial fists had transformed the palace into a fortress that could theoretically withstand years of siege, yet the systematic nature of traitor preparations suggested that conventional defensive strategies might prove inadequate against enemies who possessed intimate knowledge of Imperial military doctrine and the resources of half the galaxy's Space Marine legions. The defensive strategy that emerged from these planning sessions assigned the White Scars a crucial role as the mobile reserve force capable of responding to breakthrough attempts anywhere along the palace's vast perimeter. The Legion's jetbikes and land speeders would provide rapid reinforcement to threatened sectors, while their traditional hit-and-run tactics could disrupt traitor assault formations before they achieved decisive penetration of the defensive lines. This assignment played to the White Scar's strengths while addressing the fundamental challenge of defending fixed positions against enemies who possessed superior numbers and firepower. The modification of White Scar's equipment for siege warfare operations required extensive cooperation with Imperial Fist artificers and Mechanicum tech adepts who understood the specific requirements of defensive combat. Standard jetbike configurations needed additional armor plating to survive the concentrated firepower that characterized siege operations, while communication systems required hardening against the electromagnetic interference generated by massive artillery bombardments. The Legion's land speeders received upgraded weapon systems designed for anti-infantry work rather than the anti-vehicle configurations that had proven effective during mobile campaigns against conventional enemies. The first major test of these adaptations came during the preliminary bombardments that preceded the main traitor assault, as Horus's forces subjected Terra's defenses to systematic destruction attempts using orbital platforms and long-range artillery that exceeded anything previously deployed in human warfare. The intensity of these bombardments created conditions where traditional communication methods became unreliable, forcing White Scar's commanders to develop new protocols for maintaining unit coordination under extreme electromagnetic interference. The Legion's Storm Seers proved invaluable during these operations, their abilities allowing them to maintain contact between scattered units when conventional methods failed completely. The traitor forces' approach to siege warfare demonstrated sophisticated understanding of Imperial defensive doctrine, combined with innovations that reflected their access to forbidden technologies and demonic assistance. The systematic targeting of communication nodes and command centers suggested intelligence capabilities that allowed enemy commanders to identify critical vulnerabilities within Terra's defensive network. More disturbing were reports of reality warping, effects accompanying certain bombardments, indicating that chaos corruption had progressed to the point where traitor forces could deploy weapons that violated fundamental physical laws. The Battle of the Lion's Gate spaceport represented the first major engagement where White Scar's forces encountered the full extent of traitor capabilities and the personal corruption that had transformed former allies into something fundamentally inhuman. The spaceport's strategic importance as Terra's primary orbital interface made it a crucial objective for both sides, as control of the facility would determine whether Loyalist forces could receive reinforcements from off-world or whether traitor fleets could establish secure landing zones for their ground forces. The massive scale of the installation, covering several square kilometers of fortified terrain, required defensive strategies that combined static positions with mobile counterattack capabilities. Mortarian's personal leadership of the assault on Lion's Gate demonstrated how completely the Deathlord had embraced the corruption he had once claimed to oppose. The Primarch, who had built his reputation on resistance to supernatural influences, now wielded powers that defied rational explanation, his very presence causing reality to warp in ways that transformed the battlefield into a nightmare landscape of toxic fog and diseased terrain. The Death Guard forces under his command had undergone similar transformations, their once pristine armor now bearing the marks of plague and decay, while their tactical discipline remained intact despite their physical corruption. The Khan's decision to engage Mortarion in personal combat reflected both strategic necessity and philosophical conviction about the nature of the conflict consuming the Imperium. The Death Lord's presence on the battlefield provided a focal point for traitor morale, while his supernatural abilities allowed him to coordinate attacks that conventional commanders could not have managed. The elimination of such a crucial enemy leader could potentially disrupt the entire assault, yet Jaghatai recognized that the confrontation would also serve as a symbolic representation of the broader struggle between human civilization and the forces seeking to destroy it. The duel between the two Primarchs took place amid the ruins of the spaceport's central terminal, a massive structure that had once welcomed visitors from across the galaxy, but now served as a fortress where Loyalist defenders made their final stand against overwhelming numbers of traitor forces. The building's architecture, designed for civilian use rather than military operations, created a complex three-dimensional battlefield where both combatants could utilize their superhuman mobility while the ongoing battle raged around them. The clash of their weapons echoed across the spaceport as White Scars and Death Guard forces continued their own desperate struggle for control of the facility. Mortarion's transformation had enhanced his already formidable combat capabilities with supernatural powers that allowed him to manipulate the battlefield environment in ways that challenged traditional concepts of single combat. The toxic fog that surrounded the Death Lord corroded metal and stone, while causing debilitating effects on any living being who breathed it, forcing Jaghatai to rely on his enhanced physiology and the protective systems built into his armor to maintain combat effectiveness. The Khan's traditional emphasis on speed and precision faced its ultimate test against an opponent whose corruption had made him virtually immune to conventional weapons while granting him abilities that defied natural law. The philosophical dimensions of their combat reflected the broader ideological conflict that had torn the Imperium apart, as each Primarch fought not merely for tactical advantage, but for validation of fundamentally incompatible worldviews. Mortarion's embrace of chaos corruption represented the ultimate rejection of the imperial truth and the rational materialism that had guided human expansion during the Great Crusade. His transformation into something beyond human limitations demonstrated the power available to those willing to abandon their essential humanity in pursuit of strength sufficient to survive in a hostile universe. Jaghatai's response to these temptations reflected the wisdom he had gained through decades of integrating shamanic traditions with practical leadership experience. The Khan understood that true strength came not from abandoning human limitations, but from accepting them while working within those constraints to achieve objectives that transcended individual capability. His combat style during the duel emphasized technique and tactical thinking over raw power, using Mortarion's supernatural abilities against him by exploiting the predictable patterns that even enhanced capabilities created when applied without sufficient understanding of their limitations. The climax of their confrontation came when Jaghatai succeeded in severing one of Mortarian's wings, a feat that required precise timing and perfect execution under conditions where a single mistake would have resulted in immediate death. The injury, while not fatal to a being of Mortarian's enhanced constitution, demonstrated that even supernatural corruption could not eliminate all vulnerabilities when faced with opponents who possessed sufficient skill and determination. The Death Lord's withdrawal from direct combat marked a turning point in the battle for Lion's Gate, as his absence allowed Loyalist forces to consolidate their positions and prepare for the next phase of the siege. The coordination between White Scars, Imperial Fists, and Blood Angels forces during the spaceport's defense demonstrated the potential effectiveness of combined arms operations when different Legion specialties were properly integrated. Rogel Dorn's systematic approach to defensive planning provided the framework within which White Scar's mobility and Blood Angel's aerial superiority could achieve maximum impact against enemy assault formations. The success of these coordinated operations required unprecedented levels of inter-legion cooperation, as traditional rivalries and doctrinal differences had to be set aside in favor of tactical necessities. The communication systems that enabled this coordination represented significant innovations in Imperial military technology, as the electromagnetic interference generated by siege warfare conditions had rendered conventional methods unreliable or completely ineffective. The integration of Storm Seer abilities with technological solutions created hybrid systems that maintained functionality under extreme conditions, while providing the real-time information flow necessary for coordinating complex multi-unit operations. These innovations would prove crucial during subsequent phases of the siege, as traitor forces escalated their efforts to breach Terra's defenses. The broader strategic situation across Terra's surface revealed the systematic nature of traitor planning and the overwhelming scale of resources that Horus had committed to the siege. Multiple simultaneous assaults against different sectors of the palace perimeter forced Loyalist commanders to make difficult decisions about resource allocation while preventing the concentration of forces that might have achieved decisive results in any single engagement. The traitor's strategy appeared designed to exhaust Loyalist reserves through sustained pressure rather than seeking immediate breakthrough, suggesting confidence that time favored the attacking forces. The White Scar's role as mobile reserve required constant redeployment between threatened sectors, with jet bike squadrons racing across the palace's vast expanse to reinforce positions that came under heavy attack. The Legion's traditional emphasis on independent operation proved valuable in these conditions, as individual units could respond to developing situations without waiting for detailed orders from higher command levels. The flexibility of White Scar's tactical doctrine allowed them to adapt quickly to the specific requirements of each engagement while maintaining the aggressive spirit that had characterized their operations throughout the Great Crusade. The psychological impact of fighting former allies affected all Loyalist forces, but the White Scars faced particular challenges due to their previous relationships with several traitor legions. The discovery of Alpha Legion infiltrators among refugee populations forced the implementation of security measures that conflicted with traditional White Scars' openness to civilian populations. The systematic nature of enemy intelligence operations meant that any information could potentially be compromised, creating an atmosphere of suspicion that undermined the trust relationships essential for effective military operations. The evidence of demonic manifestation among traitor forces created additional challenges that required fundamental modifications to established tactical doctrine. Conventional weapons proved ineffective against entities that existed partially outside normal space-time, while the reality warping effects associated with major demon presence could transform familiar terrain into alien landscapes where normal navigation methods became useless. The White Scar's Storm Seers provided crucial capabilities for detecting and countering these supernatural threats, their shamanic training having prepared them to recognize phenomena that purely technological approaches could not address. The siege's progression revealed the true scope of chaos corruption within the traitor forces, as units that had once exemplified Space Marine discipline and honor transformed into something that barely retained human characteristics. The systematic nature of this corruption suggested that the rebellion represented far more than a political dispute between competing visions of imperial governance. It constituted an existential threat to human civilization that could only be resolved through the complete destruction of one side or the other. The Khan's understanding of this reality influenced his tactical decisions throughout the siege, as he recognized that conventional concepts of military honor and restraint had become irrelevant when facing enemies who sought to destroy the very concept of rational existence. The final collapse of Terra's outer defenses marked the beginning of the end for both the siege and the Horus heresy itself. As traitor forces breached the palace's ultimate perimeter and Horus prepared for his confrontation with the Emperor aboard the Vengeful Spirit, Jaghatai Khan found himself commanding the desperate rearguard actions that would determine whether any loyalist forces survived the rebellion's climactic moments. The White Scar's jetbike screamed through the palace's burning corridors as the Khan's warriors fought to maintain escape routes for civilian populations, while simultaneously preventing traitor forces from consolidating their territorial gains. The Legion's traditional mobility advantages proved crucial during these final hours, as their ability to strike quickly and withdraw before enemy reinforcements could respond allowed them to achieve tactical successes that would have been impossible for conventional forces. The Emperor's victory over Horus aboard the War Master's flagship brought an abrupt end to the siege, but the sudden cessation of hostilities left the Imperium facing challenges that would reshape human civilization for millennia to come. The systematic destruction of Terra's infrastructure, combined with the massive casualties suffered by loyalist forces, created a power vacuum that threatened to tear apart what remained of Imperial authority. The White Scars found themselves among the few intact military units capable of maintaining order during the chaotic transition period that followed the heresy's conclusion, their operational independence and intact command structure making them invaluable for addressing the immediate crises that emerged across the galaxy. The Dark Eldar raids that began appearing across Imperial space during the post-heresy reconstruction period initially seemed like opportunistic attacks by Xeno's pirates seeking to exploit the Imperium's temporary weakness. These raids followed patterns that had become familiar during the Great Crusade: swift strikes against isolated settlements, the systematic harvesting of captives, and immediate withdrawal before Imperial forces could mount effective responses. The raiders' superior technology and intimate knowledge of Imperial defensive doctrine made them formidable opponents, but their apparent focus on slave-taking suggested motivations that could be understood within conventional strategic frameworks. Jaghatai's investigation into these raids revealed disturbing patterns that suggested coordination and intelligence capabilities far exceeding anything that opportunistic pirates should have possessed. The systematic targeting of specific population centers, the precise timing of attacks to avoid Imperial patrol schedules, and the raiders' ability to anticipate and counter loyalist response tactics indicated access to intelligence sources within Imperial command structures. More troubling was evidence that the raids were not random predation, but carefully planned operations designed to achieve specific objectives that remained unclear to Imperial analysts. The Khan's pursuit of these raiders led him deeper into the mysteries surrounding the ancient webway network that he had been investigating since the early years of the Great Crusade. The Dark Eldar's ability to appear and disappear without warning clearly depended on access to transportation methods that bypassed normal space entirely, using the same network of tunnels and passages that Jaghatai had explored during his clandestine expeditions. The connection between the raiders and the webway provided the first concrete evidence that the ancient network remained actively controlled by hostile forces rather than simply being an abandoned relic of a vanished civilization. The intelligence gathered during White Scar's counter-raids against Dark Eldar positions revealed the true scope of their civilization and the existential threat they posed to human expansion. The raiders were not merely pirates, but representatives of a sophisticated society that had survived the fall of their ancient empire by retreating into the webway's protected dimensions. Their continued existence depended on regular harvests of psychic energy obtained through the systematic torture and abuse of captives taken from real space civilizations, creating a predatory relationship that made any form of coexistence impossible. The Dark Eldar's mastery of webway technology exceeded anything that Imperial forces had achieved, demonstrating capabilities that suggested either direct inheritance from the network's original builders or millennia of practical experience with its operation. Their cities existed in pocket dimensions connected to the main network, protected from external attack while providing staging areas for raids across vast distances. The scale of their infrastructure indicated a civilization that had maintained technological advancement throughout the ages of galactic upheaval that had reduced other species to primitive barbarism. The strategic implications of this discovery forced Jaghatai to reconsider fundamental assumptions about the Imperium's long-term survival prospects. The Dark Eldar's ability to strike anywhere within the galaxy without warning made conventional defensive strategies inadequate, while their technological superiority in crucial areas suggested that direct military confrontation would likely result in Imperial defeat. The Khan recognized that addressing this threat would require innovative approaches that combined military action with deeper understanding of the webway's operation and the vulnerabilities that might exist within Dark Eldar society. The Great Hunt began as a limited reconnaissance mission designed to gather intelligence about Dark Eldar capabilities and operational patterns. Jaghatai personally led a small force of his most trusted warriors through captured webway portals, using modified equipment designed to function in the network's unique environment. The initial objectives were modest: locate Dark Eldar staging areas, assess their defensive capabilities, and identify potential weaknesses that could be exploited in future operations. The Khan's experience with webway navigation, gained through years of clandestine exploration, provided the expertise necessary to attempt such a dangerous mission. The environment within the Dark Eldar sections of the webway defied easy description, combining architectural elements that seemed to shift between different aesthetic philosophies without apparent logic or consistency. The raiders had modified the ancient passages to serve their own purposes, creating chambers designed for the systematic torture of captives and the harvesting of psychic energy through methods that challenged human comprehension. The very air within these spaces seemed tainted with malevolence, carrying psychic resonances that affected even the enhanced minds of space marines in ways that conventional training had not prepared them to handle. The Dark Eldar forces that the White Scars encountered during their initial penetration of the network demonstrated tactical sophistication that exceeded Imperial intelligence estimates. The raiders had prepared extensive defensive positions within the webway passages, using their superior knowledge of the network's geometry to create killing zones where Imperial forces could be trapped and destroyed without the possibility of retreat. Their weapons technology proved devastatingly effective against Space Marine armor, while their mobility advantages allowed them to concentrate overwhelming firepower at critical points before withdrawing to prepared positions. The running battles that characterized the early phases of the Great Hunt revealed both the potential and the limitations of Imperial forces operating within the webway environment. The White Scar's traditional emphasis on speed and maneuver proved valuable in the network's corridors, where conventional formations would have been vulnerable to the kind of ambush tactics that the Dark Eldar employed. However, the raiders' intimate knowledge of the terrain and their ability to seal or redirect passages created strategic challenges that required constant adaptation of established tactical doctrine. The psychological impact of prolonged operations within Dark Eldar territory affected the entire expedition force, as the constant exposure to environments designed to inflict psychological trauma took its toll even on the enhanced minds of Space Marines. The shamanic traditions that had shaped White Scar's culture provided some protection against these effects, as the Legion's storm seers possessed techniques for maintaining mental equilibrium under extreme stress. However, the systematic nature of Dark Eldar psychological warfare meant that even these protections had limitations when faced with enemies who had perfected torture as both an art and a science. The deeper the White Scars penetrated into Dark Eldar territory, the more apparent it became that the Great Hunt was transforming from a reconnaissance mission into something approaching a crusade against forces that represented everything antithetical to human civilization. The evidence of systematic atrocities committed against Imperial citizens, combined with the raiders' obvious delight in inflicting suffering, created a moral imperative that transcended purely strategic considerations. The Khan found himself leading a campaign that had evolved beyond its original parameters into a direct confrontation with enemies whose very existence posed an existential threat to human values. The discovery of massive slave populations within Dark Eldar cities provided both opportunity and moral obligation that further complicated the mission's objectives. The captives included Imperial citizens taken during recent raids, as well as populations that had been held for generations, their descendants born into slavery and torture without any knowledge of the outside galaxy. The liberation of these populations became a secondary objective that required significant modifications to operational planning, as the logistics of evacuating thousands of civilians through hostile territory exceeded the capabilities that the expedition had been designed to handle. The White Scars' attempts to establish secure evacuation routes through the Webway network brought them into direct conflict with the major Dark Eldar factions that controlled different sections of the ancient passages. These engagements revealed the political complexity of Dark Eldar society, as different groups competed for control of territory and resources, while maintaining the cooperative relationships necessary for conducting raids into real space. The Khan's forces found themselves fighting enemies who possessed not only superior technology, but also the strategic advantages that came from operating within their own territory. The climactic phase of the Great Hunt occurred when Jaghatai's forces succeeded in penetrating the heart of one of the major Dark Eldar cities, a vast complex that existed in a pocket dimension connected to the main Webway network through a series of heavily fortified gateways. The city's architecture reflected the twisted aesthetic preferences of its inhabitants, with buildings designed to channel screams and suffering in ways that created symphonies of agony for the entertainment of the ruling classes. The systematic nature of the cities designed for the infliction of pain demonstrated how completely the Dark Eldar had embraced cruelty as a fundamental aspect of their civilization. The battle for the city's central districts required the White Scars to adapt their tactics to urban warfare conditions, unlike anything they had previously encountered. The Dark Eldar defenders possessed intimate knowledge of every passage and chamber, using hidden routes and concealed positions to launch attacks that seemed to come from impossible directions. The city's architecture itself became a weapon, as the raiders activated systems that transformed familiar environments into death traps, designed to channel attackers into killing zones, where concentrated firepower could achieve maximum effect. The Khan's personal confrontation with the Dark Eldar leadership provided insight into the fundamental corruption that had transformed the once proud Eldar civilization into something that existed solely to inflict suffering on others. The beings he faced retained the physical beauty and supernatural grace of their ancestors, but their minds had been twisted by millennia of indulgence in the darkest aspects of sentient nature. Their conversation revealed a worldview that viewed torture and cruelty not as necessary evils, but as the highest forms of artistic expression, demonstrating how completely they had abandoned any connection to the values that had once made their civilization great. The mysterious disappearance of Jaghatai Khan occurred during the final phases of the battle for the Dark Eldar city, as the Primarch led the assault on the central spire that served as both fortress and temple for the raiders' ruling council. The White Scars forces that accompanied him reported that the Khan had been pursuing fleeing Dark Eldar leaders through a series of interconnected chambers when he suddenly vanished without trace or explanation. The search efforts that followed found no evidence of the Primarch's fate, no body, no signs of struggle, and no indication of where he might have gone or what might have happened to him. The various theories that emerged to explain the Khan's disappearance reflected both the mysterious nature of the webway environment and the profound impact that his loss had on the White Scar's Legion. Some believed that he had been killed by dark Eldar weapons designed to completely destroy their targets, leaving no physical remains that could be recovered by his followers. Others suggested that he had become lost within the webway's infinite passages, condemned to wander the ancient network until he could find a route back to real space. The most optimistic theories proposed that he had discovered something of crucial importance that required his continued presence within the network, pursuing objectives that transcended immediate tactical considerations. The White Scar's withdrawal from the webway following their Primarch's disappearance marked the end of the Great Hunt as an active military operation, but the beginning of a quest that would define the Legion's identity for millennia to come. The surviving White Scars refused to accept that their father was truly gone, maintaining the belief that he would eventually return to lead them once again. This conviction became central to the chapter's culture and operational doctrine, influencing everything from recruitment practices to strategic planning as they prepared for the day when the Khan would emerge from whatever realm had claimed him. The continued adherence to Jaghatai's teachings within the White Scars chapter reflected the profound impact that the Primarch's philosophy and leadership methods had on his sons. The emphasis on speed, flexibility, and independent thinking that had characterized the Legion during the Great Crusade became institutionalized within chapter doctrine, creating a military culture that valued innovation and adaptability over rigid adherence to standardized procedures. The integration of Chogorian traditions with imperial military doctrine continued to distinguish the White Scars from other Space Marine chapters, maintaining the unique identity that their Primarch had forged during the early years of the Great Crusade. The ongoing search for the Khan became a defining element of White Scar's operations throughout the millennia following the heresy, with chapter resources regularly devoted to investigating reports of Primarch sightings or evidence of his continued existence. These searches took White Scar's forces to the galaxy's most dangerous regions, from the Eye of Terror's chaotic storms to the mysterious depths of unexplored space where ancient secrets lay hidden. The chapter's willingness to pursue even the most tenuous lights demonstrated their absolute conviction that their father lived and would eventually return to them. The enduring influence of Chogorian culture on the chapter manifested in numerous ways that distinguished the White Scars from their fellow Space Marines. The shamanic traditions that had shaped the Legion's early development continued to influence chapter practices, with Storm Seers maintaining their role as spiritual guides and weather readers despite the formal restrictions imposed by imperial doctrine. The emphasis on personal honor and tribal loyalty that had characterized Chogorian society provided frameworks for understanding duty and obligation that complemented rather than conflicted with imperial military discipline. The White Scar's role in the modern Imperium as swift executioners of the Emperors will reflected both their tactical capabilities and their philosophical approach to warfare. The chapter's preference for rapid deployment and decisive action made them ideal for responding to threats that required immediate attention, while their operational independence allowed them to function effectively in situations where conventional command structures had broken down. Their reputation for appearing without warning to strike at the Imperium's enemies earned them respect throughout Imperial military circles, even as their methods sometimes conflicted with more conservative approaches to Space Marine deployment. The legacy of Jaghatai Khan extended far beyond the immediate impact of his military innovations or political decisions to encompass fundamental questions about the nature of leadership and the proper relationship between individual freedom and collective responsibility. His synthesis of Chogorian traditions with imperial doctrine created a model for cultural integration that influenced imperial policy toward newly conquered worlds throughout the millennia following the heresy. The Khan's example demonstrated that diversity of thought and approach could strengthen rather than weaken human civilization, providing alternatives to the rigid uniformity that characterized many aspects of imperial governance. The mystery surrounding the Khan's ultimate fate continues to inspire speculation and hope among his sons, who maintain their vigil across the galaxy while pursuing their duties as the Emperor's warriors. Whether Jaghatai Khan still wanders the webway's infinite passages, fights battles in dimensions beyond human comprehension, or waits for the proper moment to return to real space, his influence on the White Scars and the broader Imperium remains undiminished. The Warhawk of Chogoris achieved a form of immortality not through the preservation of his physical form, but through the enduring power of the ideals and traditions he established, ensuring that his legacy would continue to shape human civilization long after his mysterious disappearance into the darkness between the stars.